Are we good?
Are we good? Ready yet? Roll it.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, good afternoon. Happy Sunday. So this is always, first of all, it's thank you for being here, whether it's virtually or in person. This is a subject that I absolutely love, and it's super important to me, not just personally, but professionally. So I love that it's of interest to you guys as well. So first, a few things just to get these out of the way. My name is Logan. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. And my favorite titles are sex educator, author, provocateur, but of course not in a gratuitous way, with a purpose, of course. And I'm a hockey parent, so I spend a lot of time schlepping like the nastiest equipment known to humankind around in assorted vehicles. But that's okay. So the first thing I really want to do is, for me, it's super hard to talk about any of these issues without knowing who I'm talking to and why we're here and what we're hoping to get out of this conversation. I think that oftentimes we look at young people's sexual development, and because we get so many mixed messages, it's hard to recognize like how common and typical a lot of behaviors are. I'm asked often to, talk to med school students, and oftentimes they'll say, like, we want to know what's pathological. I'm like, well, most of the things are not. Like, most of the things you're asking me are not pathological, right? It's part of development. So I want us to understand what is really typical. I want us to think about how to broaden the models of what sexual health looks like so that it's not simply about using protection, which is an important part of it, but certainly not limited to that. And also to really think about how so much of young people's culture and technology, access to pornography, how all of those things can impact them, the opportunities that they have for growth and development, and also some of the things that are more challenging. And then, of course, for those of you who are working with the parents and caregivers, to have some tools to think about how your clients can create comfortable environments at home to talk, because oftentimes we show up as clients because of the misinformation we got as young people. So there are certain things we can attempt to curb early on. So, okay, so here's what is always most why I think we're here, and it just recaps what you've all said, which is that when it comes to people's children's sex life, and I'll say children, I don't necessarily mean they have to be biologically yours, whatever the caregiver role you have is in your life, they want to come to you for guidance. They want to develop confidence around these issues. They are very concerned with giving the wrong information at the wrong time. That we live with this umbrella term of age appropriateness, and what does that mean? Most people are afraid of screwing up their kids in some way, which is why oftentimes we become almost intellectually paralyzed by the fear of messing things up, and then we just stick our heads in the sand and don't do anything at all, and wait for something else, something catastrophic to come in where we have to do something. They don't have all the facts. Facts keep changing. Language definitions keep changing. I mean, just think the language around gender has expanded so much that oftentimes people have absolutely, no idea what these terms mean. And also, oftentimes parents and caregivers are consumed with the idea that there are certain things we just keep private. We don't look at, we don't talk about, we don't show the rest of the world, whether that's the small world or, a bigger world. So just to say that I have a stake in all of this as well. I am the parent of a 10-year-old daughter and a 14-year-old son. So there's nothing that I share professionally that I don't actually practice in my own home too. So I really operate in both worlds, and you should know that if I share any stories about my kids, I've gotten their consent in advance to share them with you. We are very upfront about the things that we will discuss, and if they say no, then it does not get discussed. So there you go. So I alluded to this before. One of the things that saddens me so much about the world that we live in is that we've become so fearful about young people and sexuality. And it doesn't really make a difference what our political perspective is, but even just looking around what's going on in the world, we have a lot of sources out there that are making young people's sexual lives and identities something to be afraid of, something that's ugly, something that is harmful. And that's really sad. I think we've forgotten that the core of all of our beings is our sexuality, and that throughout our lives we choose to express it in a lot of different ways, but it's certainly far more than what you choose to do, who you choose to do it with, in what room of your house, right? Like, it's not about that. So most of the things we talk about developmentally are really typical. They're things that most people in some way, shape, and form experience and that are not pathological. And we'll sort of see that as we go through some stages of development. So you should know that for me, my philosophy is that I think sex and sexuality are these amazing and wonderful aspects of our life. I believe that everything that we say, in particularly to young people, should be based in facts. You know, for me as a sexuality educator, it's not my job to teach for my own personal values. Though, I will say this, if I'm in a classroom, the fact that I'm teaching sexuality education, there is a value attached to that. Right? I believe that young people are entitled to have information. I believe in being inclusive, meaning I don't make any assumptions about who my groups are. We all have a lot of diverse identities. Some are very visible identities and some are not. And all of those matter and all of those deserve to be represented. I think that it's our job to challenge the sexual double standard. I don't think it is helpful or healthy to have two separate sets of standards for people based on sex or gender. That is one of the things that, for those of you who are working with the adults and have some challenges with, right? Because all of us bring our own belief systems to child rearing, and oftentimes those double standards we butt our heads against quite a bit. You know, I do challenge stereotypes about gender expression. I think that was always the world we live in, but certainly more so now than ever before, with the great amount of information and diversity of gender expressions out there. Our young people are far better versed in these issues than often their adult caregivers are. And of course, I believe in fostering people's self-esteem and teaching critical thinking skills as it relates to all sort of aspects of media they consume, whether that's digital or, you know, analog. And then fundamentally at the core of this is that everyone has the right to their own voice, to their own body, and to make decisions solely based on those things and to have ownership over them. So every community is more diverse than we think. I mean, one of the things that has always sort of amazed me, and I was doing a workshop in the South 2 years ago with a business networking group, and I was there doing a parenting workshop. And afterwards, there was supposed to be this like social meet and greet event, but I never even made it into the room because there was a line of people who asked me to speak to them privately. And every family who came to speak to me had some kind of gender non-conforming child. And they would absolutely not have shared this with each other, and there were so many families going through the same exact experience, and I thought, oh my God, everyone keeps this quiet, but in reality, there's so much to learn from one another, and there's so many resources available, but we don't always, we tend to assume that if a group looks a certain way, that the values are all the same, that their experiences are all the same, and they just never have been. So, you know, how do we typically gather information about our clients? What do we do? What do we do to sort of get their perspectives on life or their own experiences? Yeah, right? We ask. And I mean, I did that with you in an introduction to see why you were here, and just even the mere discussion of pronouns, which I think is the template that we're all going to be moving more towards, because, I mean, I was at a meeting recently and someone said to me, it wasn't a sexuality-based meeting, it was something totally different, and someone said to me, you know, I don't understand why we need to ask pronouns. And I said, well, he said, you know, in my employee forums, like, why is it a big deal? And I said, well, let me ask you something. I said, how long does it take you to have one line on your employment intake that says pronoun? Like, how much work is that? And he said to me, well, it's not that much work. I said, okay. I said, and what if I told you that by merely asking someone how they wanted to be referred to, changed, at a high, like like level, better mental health and self-confidence, less likely to self-harm. But even on a really low rung in terms of like worker productivity, it increased because this person knew that they were working for someone who cared about who they were. And so he said to me, oh, I didn't really think about that. I'm like, okay, so, again, oftentimes we take these things for granted, but simply like saying, this is who I am, tell me who you are, a little goes a really long way, in particular with young people who are so used to people making assumptions about them all the time based on these really stereotypical, silly things. So it's always important to remember that. Okay. Forget everything you've learned before about sexuality and young people. Blank slates from here on out. Because think about it, we get a lot of information about young people and sex and their sexuality and when they become sexual beings, as if they were never sexual beings right from the start. But they are, and they always have been. So for me, I bristle every time I hear people talk about age appropriateness because there really is no such thing. And it's the one thing that I think prevents us so often from actually doing what we need to do as adults and parents and caregivers and aunts and uncles, that we're so afraid of saying something at this like wrong time, as if there's this one magical window that opens and like, this is the time you're supposed to talk. No. So I love to say that I have young students that are absolutely capable of hearing really sophisticated information about sex. And I've worked with adults who absolutely are not, right? You know those people too, right? Some young people really are good at like hearing things, understanding them, filing them away, and some adults that can't. So I think that my issue with the term appropriateness and age appropriateness is that it winds up shutting down conversations before they even happen. In fact, it's funny, appropriateness is actually not a word that I really use in my house, and anytime my own children say it, I know they've gotten it from somewhere else. And I think mostly, and you'll start to hear when I ramble on for long enough, that I really have concerns about language, because I think language is so deeply personal, and language and our intent and connotation drastically changes how we perceive something. So for me, most of the time, historically, when I think about how that word appropriate was used, if someone was doing something, or if I was doing something and someone said, that's not appropriate, right? What's our reaction? As like a young person, we freeze, we feel guilt and shame, and it shuts down any conversation. Right? So let's say I have a conversation about a body part and I'm in a public and I ask the adult I'm with and they say that's not appropriate. That doesn't leave the door open for ongoing conversations. That just shuts it down. So, yes, there are times we're going to talk about appropriateness, but I think it's also important to remember that if we say something's inappropriate, it might be inappropriate for that moment in time because of context, but that we don't shut down future conversations, because oftentimes that's what winds up taking place. So I don't know how many of you have seen this model. Anyone? Show of hands. A few. So the gender unicorn. So the way I've sort of structured this conversation today is that I've taken what I typically do when I'm working in schools and with parents and caregivers and sort of blown it up bigger, and really doing a history of who we are, the language we use, and then to move into what's actually taking place in young people's lives. So we are a combination of all of these things that the cute gender unicorn is modeling here, which is our assigned sex at birth, our gender identity, how we express or present that gender, and then of course different types of attraction. I use this model a lot with young people. I think it's a nice way for them to think about really how multifaceted we all are, and that if I were to give every single person like a blank unicorn, we would all fill it out differently, right? Because we are all different, and all of these aspects of who we are are different, and that's okay. And sometimes, in particular, when you're working with really young people, having that model and seeing, oh, that blank slate I can fill out however I want is really empowering. And also when you're working with adults, it's really helpful for them to see, no, your young person isn't this one thing. They are a lot of these things together. And those develop in lots of different ways. Just because you're one part here doesn't mean you're the same part up there. Okay, so I want to take us through each of those aspects because this is the language oftentimes that young people hear now, or we as professionals are using, and oftentimes you might be working with adults who come to you and say, well, I don't understand what that means. So assigned sex at birth is basically how your body developed biologically, chromosomally, hormonally, during in utero development. Now, the funny thing is, I will show this picture to my students, and I probably should have told you who my students are. So I have been, I'm going to take a brief pause from this for 1 second because I feel context is important. I've been a sexuality educator since the age of 15. So you can just take a guess at how many decades that's been. And I was a 15-year-old peer HIV and AIDS educator when I came home after school one day. I grew up in the suburbs in Long Island, and my parents had condoms and bananas on our dinner table. And they said, this is how you use a condom, and next week you become a peer educator. And I said, oh, okay. Now, my parents weren't super liberal, right? But it was this unbelievable blip of time in the late 80s, early 90s, where HIV was finally being publicly discussed as a virus that did not discriminate. It needed a fluid or a mucous membrane. It did not care about anything else, right? And all of a sudden, groups of parents who had never spoken to young people about sex of any kind ever before were all of a sudden getting involved. So that's how I started in this space. And from there, I wound up doing my master's and PhD, both in human sexuality education and in very, within the umbrella of education. So I'm not a therapist. I'm not a counselor, like I'm an educator. And I work in a lot of different schools in a lot of different capacities. My youngest students typically are 8. My eldest have been 92 or something like that. So when I show my young students this image, the funny thing is, inevitably, someone will yell out, oh my God, that's such a cute boy. To which I look at them and say, I don't know about you, but what makes that a boy? So immediately, even from seeing this one image, we start to make assumptions, which clearly are based on, there is nothing, and truth be told, I have absolutely no idea what the assigned sex of this baby is. I literally pulled it from a Google image search.
I saw a girl.
There you go. See? So, who knows? But this idea is that, we are more than our body parts, but oftentimes it's our body parts that seem to define who we are. And really, if you think about it, aside from sort of the in utero development, assigned sex is assigned publicly by a doctor who looks between a baby's legs and makes some sort of proclamation based on what those body parts are. But what's interesting is how gender tracking starts immediately from that declaration in some way, right? Like if someone has a baby, if you think about what gifts are showing up at their home, like all of a sudden they are really segregated by color or like.
Just the sonogram.
Yeah, yes, from that. Oh, we'll get to that. Yes. Like so even before birth. So assigned sex is basically how our bodies form. And, the interesting thing is, and this is what I certainly do with my younger students as well, so I'm not telling you anything I don't tell them, is that we talk so much in terms of binaries, right? That even assigned sex is a binary. You have a penis and testicles or you have a vulva and vagina. But that's actually not really accurate either. So there's an entire population of people who are intersex, right? Intersex describes a range of conditions where someone's sexual or reproductive anatomy doesn't fit what we typically anticipate someone who's male or someone who's female to look like, right? So even the idea of assigned sex doesn't come in a pair either, and oftentimes we don't even talk about this, which means that when kids understand that they are intersex, what does that mean for them if all of a sudden they've been tracked a certain way and they don't fit that mold, or their friends don't understand that they, you could be something different than simply assigned male or assigned female. So this is part of who we are, but doesn't necessarily define who we are.
Can I share
Yeah.
a story? So I'm from Kuwait. My wife is from Saudi. So I have 6 boys. That's why I saw a girl. But my fourth one's name is Rayyan, which in Saudi is a boy's name, but in Kuwait is a girl's name.
Yeah.
He was born in New York. So when we applied for the birth certificate in Kuwait, so we got the New York one it said male. I got it back, it said female. So I sent the person who went to do it back to the woman, and I said, why did you put female? And she said, Rayyan is a girl's name. I said, I didn't ask your opinion.
Yeah.
The birth certificate said male. It's about just copying it over.
Right.
So even when you get facts, sometimes you...
Yes, very much so. I mean, I will say, growing up with a name like Logan in the 70s and 80s, I mean, there is still, the good news is, if I get any mail that's addressed to Mr. Logan Levkoff, I know I can immediately throw it out. Right? Because I know this person obviously has no idea who I am. They're trying to get me to do something, right? It's not based on me. But yes, that happens even when the facts are laid bare to someone. So then, of course, pardon the small text, I'll read it out. And then, of course, there's this other part, which we're starting to understand more now than ever before, right? Our gender identity, which is this deep understanding of who we are and what our gender is. And young people are really starting to understand what these terms are, but these are the terms that adults get super confused by, right? So, cisgender simply means someone's assigned sex and gender identity are the same. I have a vulva and vagina, I identify as female, I'm a cisgender female. Sometimes we hear it called cis. Transgender means that someone's assigned sex and their gender identity are not the same, right? And this is where language starts to really count, because I'll have a lot of students who say things like, oh, someone wants to become a boy. And I'll say, no, there's no becoming someone else. You are who you are. Your body might not match what we assume a boy to look like. But it's not about switching. It's not about becoming. We are who we are. But clearly with parents and caregivers of kids who are trans, that becomes super challenging to understand. Right? Yeah.
So when you're talking, is this like a PowerPoint that you would use with kids?
I would use elements of it with both, with parents as well as kids.
So when you're presenting this information to the kids in schools,
Yeah.
right? How is that experience, specifically with do the kids kind of get it, or?
So I have to say, I've been super lucky that throughout the years, I've worked in schools with a lot of kids who are trans, non-binary in some way. All the kids know, and they're really amazing about it. And have even seen certain kids transition through the years, and it's really a breathtaking thing to see sort of how flexible young people can be. The adults are far more challenged in a lot of ways. But sometimes it's a matter of, and it's like going back to the concept of the unicorn, to let young people think about, why are you who you are? Right? And it doesn't necessarily have to be that slide with all the text and things like that, but I think recognizing that there are a lot of different elements that go into who we are, and how cool is it that we're not all the same, and that we can build those blocks and put those blocks together in lots of different ways. Okay. But of course, because binaries really don't work that much, there are lots of us who don't identify our own gender with a binary either. So whether someone identifies as non-binary, genderqueer, gender fluid, agender, where neither the terms male or female feel relevant, or gender fluid, where our identity shifts, we are going to have lots of young people who experience life like this. And the amazing thing is that the question that comes up a lot is often are there more non-binary kids than ever before? Or were we always here? And the answer was, We've always been here. It's simply that we didn't often give people the space to exist and feel comfortable and safe. And I am not suggesting that we are perfect at it, but we're certainly getting a lot better than we were. So this idea that gender identity doesn't come in a binary, assigned sex doesn't come in a binary is really important, because oftentimes young people are super literal and they see the world through the lens that their parents have given them, which is you are this or you are this. And what does it mean for young people who don't feel like either of those terms fit? So the reinforcement of gender norms, so this is what we had said before, this concept Pauline had said about a gender reveal. So we do these weird things like in utero, right? Prior, like we set up a journey long before someone even like emerges into the world. So this admittedly drives me a little bit crazy for a lot of reasons. So these are images that were taken from the Instagram sensation of the gender reveal party, where someone is pregnant and decides to announce the, notice I'm using the word gender here in quotations, gender of a pregnancy in these ways that usually like have like pink or blue confetti shooting out of a cannon somewhere. I mean, think about that, just like initial reactions to this.
So touchdown has no innuendo?
Touchdown has to do with, right, yes. But here's the interesting thing, and this is the thing I always ask my students. I'm like, by the way, touchdowns or tutus, how oftentimes do football players train and develop core strength? Ballet. Surprise, right? So, I mean, it's a silly random thing, but this idea that like you're either a dancer or an athlete. You have to like blue or if you have to like pink. So my son is 14. Since the day he was like born, well, since the day he could voice things for himself, his favorite color has been hot pink. Always. Which is literally like super dramatic and horrible when you attempt to shop for cool like things in pink that, are what he wants as opposed to, what he would find. So it's important to remember that we reinforce these things, these stereotypes, way before someone actually is even like in the world. And oftentimes now we hear people talking, in particular celebrities, about like raising gender neutral kids, which becomes super confusing because everyone says, I don't really understand what that means. And I said, well, I don't think it's so much that they are raising children without a gender as much as it is they're not raising children that are tracked by certain stereotypes. They're just simply allowing their kids to be who they are and how they express themselves, not what the world makes assumptions that boys or girls are supposed to be like. But in reality, Pauline, to get back to your original statement, when we do these things, are they actual gender reveals? No. They're assigned sex at birth reveals. By the way, I don't ever see someone saying that on an invitation, though I'd be super stoked to get an invitation that said, welcome to my assigned sex at birth reveal. I've never gotten one, but maybe one day. Because it's not about a gender reveal. And it means that before someone is even born, we're already setting them up in certain ways. And not just to be something, but also if this young person isn't that something, right? We're already saying that there's some shame attached to that. So obviously, expectations of gender impact young people and their relationships with one another. Have any of you ever dealt with a situation where you saw with someone young that you were working with, someone clearly had an experience where someone had made an assumption about them based on how they presented gender? So, I mean, sometimes just a matter of thinking about it. But, I remember when my son was in preschool. So again, I mean, this is like age 2, 3, 4. He was wearing a pair of pink gloves. And I overheard a conversation that was taking place between 2, 3, and 4-year-olds about whether or not it was okay for my son to have pink gloves. Right? Now, kids don't start off, buying into those stereotypes. They're taught that, right? So when they come to you, if you're working with young people, right, they've gotten a big dose of how people are supposed to act, supposed to look, supposed to behave based on, a parent or caregiver's understanding of their gender, or more likely of their sex, not of their gender. But assumptions have been made. Sorry. Okay, so these are the building blocks that come in all combinations, how our bodies are assigned, how we identify gender, how we express our gender, but attraction is totally different, right? That is a totally different building block that, in our world today is also really exciting to talk about because we have so many different identifications in which to not only express gender, but to express sexual orientation. So this becomes a conversation in schools a lot, not necessarily started by the adults in a school system, but oftentimes with young people who get so much information online, right, in a digital world. So they're like, what does this mean? And what does this mean? And what if I am this word and this word and this word together? And, obviously language expands, language changes, and sometimes you are going to have young people or their parents who are going to throw a term out at you and you're going to have absolutely no idea what they're talking about, right? Which is fine. Just ask. Okay, tell me what you mean by that. Because the language does change and does evolve, and sometimes it's very nuanced, and sometimes kids actually know what the distinctions are, and sometimes they don't. So it's just important to ask. But obviously there is a difference between sexual and romantic attraction. As I describe it to young people, romantic attraction is that sort of emotional connection that pulls us to someone else. And sexual attraction is that attraction we feel in our bodies, where blood rushes to lots of places, including the genitals, and gives our body a reaction. And it's possible to have these two things together, and sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're totally separate. This is actually a video that I have to be honest, I love immensely, that I have shown to young people, and I've also shown it to parents and caregivers, mostly because I think its simplicity is also super helpful for adults. The young people get it, but it works for older populations as well. Because if our many labels and identifications of gender have gotten larger, so have our descriptions of orientation. I think Facebook has now, anyone know, like 62 different gender identification labels, I think. Like, there are a lot. And it doesn't mean that each term is explicitly different from the other term. It simply means like how we identify ourselves is a deeply personal choice, and there's some words that resonate with us more than others. So let's see, do I need to do anything to this?
No.
No, awesome, okay. So sexual orientation historically has been about talking about what terms? Gay, straight, which again, admittedly, straight describes lines, not people. I don't know really why we use it, especially when you're talking to kids who are trying to understand, like, why does that word straight relate to me and what? But maybe that's my own thing. So gay, straight, lesbian, bisexual are typically what people talk about, right? So in a world where we realize that we are beyond binaries, what does that mean for orientation? This is a video, if you ever need resources, amaze.org, and I will make sure to get you a resource list and have it sent out, has a brilliant, it's a media web education that was started with Advocates for Youth, which is a DC-based organization, as well as Answer, which is sex ed out of Rutgers, and a couple of other future of sex ed. Amazing short video clip resources on a lot of different things. This just happens to be one of my favorites. She said.
Orientation describes who you are attracted to, may fall in love with, and may have a sexual relationship with. Everyone has a sexual orientation, and there are different words to describe different sexual orientations. Many people are familiar with terms like heterosexual, gay, lesbian, and bisexual. But those aren't the only sexual orientations out there. For example, some people identify as pansexual, which means they are attracted to people of all genders. Many pansexual people feel that gender has little to do with their attractions. In other words, they are attracted to a person, not to that person's gender. Some people are asexual, sometimes called ace. Asexual people feel little or no sexual attraction to other people and have little or no interest in having sex or engaging in sexual behaviors. Many asexual people still feel romantic attraction. They feel love and affection, but may not feel sexual attraction. Demisexual people only feel sexual attraction when they have a strong romantic or emotional connection with a person. These are just some of the labels people use to describe their sexual orientation. Some people don't like to use labels at all, and that's okay too. There are many other terms out there to describe the full, diverse spectrum of human beings, and that's a beautiful thing.
So I love that so much because I think it shows in far clearer ways than seeing human beings and like making assumptions about a gender. The myriad of ways that we connect with people. And oddly enough, the adults that I work with actually really get that as much as the young people. Now, I have a lot of questions about why the asexual avocado seems to be drinking carrot juice when the carrot walks over, but that's a whole other issue.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
Was it amaze.com?
Amaze.org. ORG.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you so much.
And there are, there may be one other video from them later on, but they have tons of things for lots of different age groups about everything, about consent, about disability, about puberty. I mean, everything. And they're wonderful, and they're good discussion starters too, depending on who you're working with. You know, it's a 2-minute clip, and then you get to, talk about what people got out of it. So we're really talking about sexuality. I promise in a few minutes the language piece will end. And for me, sexuality is everything. It is who we are. It is how we express ourselves. It is the roles we play in relationships. It is our feelings, our desires, our self-esteem as it relates to our body. And then, of course, all the aspects of sex and gender and expression. But, for me, the reason we talk about these things with young people and with their caregivers is because we want people to feel good about their sexuality, no matter how they express it. But this is something that exists from birth on. This is not a switch that gets turned on at puberty. A partner doesn't flip this switch. Everyone has this. It's just whether or not we give people the skills and confidence to feel empowered by it or not. But we all have this. So now, aside from the assignment of one's body, what does sex mean? What is sex? I love it. Adults looking at me like, I don't know.
Come on, guys.
Noun, verb, then what are we looking at?
You tell me, when you hear the word sex, what's the assumption we make?
Pleasurable activity.
A pleasurable activity. Oh, I like that. A pleasurable activity, okay? If I walked in here, okay? Let's take off our learned people hats for a second. And let's take ourselves back to when we were younger. I'll say that, younger. If I walked in here and was like, oh my God, I had sex last night. What assumption would you have made about me?
12-year-old Erica would have been like, that's intercourse.
Okay, so most of the time, still, when we hear this word, the assumption is someone has had penis in vagina intercourse, right? I want to be really clear, especially with young people, that sex does not just mean that, right? For a lot of reasons. One, ethically, that's not the only type of sex that exists because not every person with a penis is having sex with someone with a vagina. First things first. But also, there's this weird hierarchy thing we do, that certain things count as more sex than other things, whereas all types of sex come with the potential for pleasure and also come with some big responsibilities. So when I use the word sex, I am talking about vaginal, anal, oral, genital contact, all of those things to me count as sex. And when I work with young people and when I work with parents, I want to make sure that everyone understands that I'm not making an assumption about what you do. I'm not ignoring who you are or what you might do as opposed to what someone else might do. And also, I'm letting adults and caregivers know that when we just define sex as one thing, we wind up alienating our children in lots of different ways. And it also prevents us from giving them tools and information because we're not thinking of like how broad sex can be. Still, to this day, when you ask parents, like, have you talked about like the birds and bees, which sounds silly to me still, they think we're only supposed to be talking about what happens when someone's penis is in someone's vagina. There is often not a wide range of talking about the myriad of ways that people can express connection and intimacy and pleasure. So sex should be as broad as it really is and not simply about one type of sex. See, there you go. Sex is not a word owned by heterosexual or cisgender people. I just need you to understand that Maleficent and Ursula is my most favorite thing in the entire world. It is amazing what you find on Google Images. I love that picture so much. And it's just a reminder, and really, like, these are the images with young people that really resonate. I mean, yes, it makes them laugh, but they could see, oh right, sometimes the models we see are super arbitrary, right? The prince is not always with the princess, and that's cool. Okay, so just a few final thoughts on language. By the way, with my young students, they're like, oh my God, the airline. I'm like, it was a record company first. It was music before it was an airline, but okay, fine. So the issue with a lot of our words is that their definitions are dependent on other definitions of words, right? So virginity becomes equally problematic if we think about, like, if we assume that a virgin is someone who's never had sex. Well, that depends on our definition of sex, right? And of course, historically and culturally, the burden to maintain one's virginity was often put on who? Right? Someone with a vulva and vagina, or, female presenting. So, again, I want us to recognize that our kids, and I mean like anyone's, the kids in our lives, they use these words a lot. And oftentimes they wind up perpetuating the same old definitions because no one says to them, be broad. What is that? Does that definition of virginity work for you? And if it doesn't, let's find a way to make it work for more people, right? So is it possible to be a virgin in this behavior but not in this behavior? Sure, great. The other thing I want young people to think about is, what are the phrases we use to describe moving from the state of virginity to non-virginity? What's the words we commonly use? We lost our virginity. Sounds super positive. You're never getting it back. I don't know where it goes, but you're never getting it back, right? So it doesn't really sound super empowering. I lost this thing. Even though it might have like social clout, right? A loss technically is not like supposed to be something empowering. What's the other phrase people use?
Pop your cherry.
Thank you for that. I appreciate it. Thank you for being bold and saying that. Popping one's cherry, which, by the way, I don't know about you, but that doesn't sound so like pleasurable and consensual and fun.
That's awful.
No, it is. It's awful. And by the way, think of how that sets young people up to think about what their first time could be like. If that's what you're bracing for, that is horrible, right? I always tell my students, like in particular the teenagers, I'm like, by the way, if you hear a popping noise during any type of sex, get yourself to the hospital. Like, that's not, like, you're not supposed to hear that. Get up, call 911. Like, that's not your expectation. So, but that's the way we constantly talk about virginity, as if A, it's measurable by this thing called the hymen, which does not measure anything, right? That it's really often something that we place the burden on like one particular sex and or gender. And then of course it really doesn't describe this shared, ideally shared consensual experience of doing something together. It's not a loss. And that it could be about a lot of different types of sex. So, abstinence is another term that parents use all the time. Teachers use it all the time. So you should know, because this is going to come up politically, that we spent in this country, let's go 10 to 20 years on abstinence only until marriage education. We've spent billions of dollars on it. It's not scientifically accurate. By the way, there are only 13 states in this country, 13, 1-3, that require medically accurate sex ed. I mean, just process that for 1 second. 13 states, medically accurate. So basically I can come in and just like lie for an hour and it's cool. I mean, that's insanity. Not to mention that it's often very heterosexist, it's very cisgendered, it's not inclusive or representative. I mean, it comes with a lot and super judgmental about anyone who has had a sexual experience. So it's problematic. It is being repackaged now, just so you know, when you go back to your own communities, as something called SRA, sexual risk avoidance. That is the new term for abstinence-only education. Now, most people will get on board because they're like, okay, I want people to avoid sexual risk. Well, it's the same old thing with a new title. And I mean, look, and again, sexual health and sex ed is political. It impacts our communities that we work with. It impacts our own life. Young people get this information. Parents are taught and caregivers to buy into this information because, they're scared into thinking this is what works. And unfortunately, that's not really the case. And people leave far worse off than they started. If you tell girls in particular that girls who have sex are like used pieces of gum, that's not really great. And you will be seeing them in their future, right? And it won't be for like empowering reasons. So again, abstinence is a really important choice for a lot of young people. It's not the only choice. At some point, people make a move from abstinent to non-abstinent. And when we tout abstinence as being the only thing that offers protection against pregnancy and STIs, that only works if your definition of sex is as broad as possible, right? But most of the time it's not. Most of the time it's fairly heterosexist and focused on one type of sex. So language matters because it's what trickles down to young people and what they internalize. And it's up to us to get them to say, what does that mean to you? Does that apply to you? Like, how might it be different? Oh, okay. So as we move into a little bit of, development, the interesting thing is that, sexual response, like physiological response, actually happens in utero. So, genitals differentiate around 6 weeks of after conception, but erectile response has been viewed at 16 weeks. Things happen to body parts because body parts are made certain ways, right? Which is always fascinating when you work with young people and they realize erectile tissue is just erectile tissue. Doesn't mean anything about you. It is literally just, a part of the body or a type of tissue within the body. So this is a Mary Roach TED Talk. It was called 10 Things You Didn't Know About Orgasm. But there was one thing in there that I really like, especially when you sometimes work with adults who struggle with their young people masturbating, as if it is something that's not considered a typical behavior. So let's see if this works. It's short.
All right. I'm going to show you a couple of images from a very diverting paper in the Journal of Ultrasound in Medicine. I'm going to go way out on a limb and say that it is the most diverting paper ever published in the Journal of Ultrasound in Medicine. The title is Observations of In Utero Masturbation. Okay, now on the left, you can see the hand, that's the big arrow, and the penis on the right, the hand hovering. And over here we have, in the words of radiologist Israel Meisner, the hand grasping the penis in a fashion resembling masturbation movement. Bear in mind, this was an ultrasound, so it would have been moving images, and orgasm is a reflex of the autonomic nervous system. Now this is...
Okay, so, I think that always makes me smile. Like, it's not something that, like, just happened. And also, if you notice, my text, my slides are typically visual. If they're text, it's not for you, it's really for me. But this wasn't just about, like, fetuses with penises. In 1996, this was a letter that was published in the American Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology, and it was an ultrasound observation of actually an assigned female fetus touching the vulva with the right hand. Caressing movements centered primarily on the region of the clitoris. Which I have to say is exciting for me, simply because I feel like even the word masturbation historically has been something we focused on people with penises. I mean, I did not even realize until I was 18 that masturbation was even something that people who were assigned female could do. It was constantly a joke in the families of my friends who had brothers, but like, if you were a single sex female family, no one talked about it. So the idea that masturbation is not, is not centered around one particular sex is exciting. Okay, so again, remember, ignore the text. It's for me to tell you. So typical sexual development and response from 0 to 5, experience erections and vaginal lubrication, touch their genitals for pleasure, talk openly about their bodies. If you've ever been around a kid in this age window, the most common times for them to talk openly about their bodies are yours or in public. Like, oh, do you have a vulva too? It's usually in front of people, strangers. Okay. They can say and understand when taught the appropriate names for body parts. This to me is a big deal, right? They can absolutely understand if we give them words, right? So admittedly, I do have the kids who, have said to their preschool teacher, when she announced that she was pregnant, she's like, I have a baby in my stomach. And my kids are like, did no one teach you it was a uterus? I was super proud. I'm like, things get digested in stomachs. Pregnancies don't develop in stomachs. So absolutely, you're right. I don't know why we rely on some of this stuff, but we do, and we do it over and over and over again. By the way, years ago, I think it was the early 2000s, there was a big debate on Bill O'Reilly's show when he used to have a show that he was very concerned that a kindergartner couldn't hear the word uterus, that if a kindergartner heard the word uterus that they would be scarred indefinitely. Just saying. They are curious about everything, bodies, other people's bodies, playing doctor, bodily functions, and so on. And they have a real certainty and sureness over their own gender, and they have the ability to distinguish between males and females, but really based on gender stereotypes, right? Not because of someone's personal identity, but based on stereotypes. So, the language piece is really important. So I was doing a little search on what information we give young people about bodies and language. And so I found this on a teaching website. This, I believe, is Tarzan from the Disney movie. I don't want to say anything, but what part is missing on the description, the body, body part identification on Tarzan?
Well, his penis.
Yeah, apparently he does not have one. He just has a loincloth that's covering nothing. Like a Ken doll, there's nothing there, right? So even at young ages, when we do things about bodies, we other the genitals and make them something scary and weird and different, which isn't such a surprise that we start to feel so uncomfortable and ashamed and guilty about them because no one has ever said it's okay. even in this one, this is a body chart that was done in Spanish, right? So it's important to remember that like our young people are basically being told all of these parts count as science, except the ones between your legs. That's different, right? So correct language does matter. This, I told you I would go back to Amaze at some point. Amaze has a new thing called Amaze Junior, which they have these print out like coloring book pages. And it was literally one of the first things I had seen. Look, circle the parts that are the same on both boys and girls: nose, nipples, eyes, vulva, belly button, and penis. I'm like, oh my God, the word vulva and penis, both. And it doesn't say vagina, it actually says vulva. So the language matters, and I think it's more than just the fact that I'm an educator and feel like words count. It upsets me tremendously when we feel like we have to have more palatable terms for body parts, that the ones that we have aren't good enough, so we have to make things up. Like, I break out into hives when people use the word vajayjay. And by the way, do you know where that started, the use of the word vajayjay? Well, Oprah used it on her show, but it was actually on Grey's Anatomy when Bailey was Dr. Bailey was delivering her baby. George O'Malley was fielding, and she looked at him and said, "O'Malley, stop looking at my vajayjay." And the reason she said that was because the standards and practices in TV shows said you could not use the word vagina a certain amount of times. By the way, like Grey's Anatomy was a hospital-based medical show, you would think that that's exactly the place you should be using those terms, right? So all of a sudden, vajayjay came into our vernacular and sort of took over. But again, like, that's not really what that is either. The parts you see between an assigned female's legs are all called the vulva, and they're super cool, and it's like the clitoral glands and the labia and the urethral opening and the vaginal opening and the mons, the vagina is inside, right? So even when we replace a term with like a more juvenile term, it's not even the right term. I once dealt in a class with a parent, and I have to say, I've been super lucky that in the 20+ years that I've been an educator, I could count on one hand the number of parents and caregivers that have had like some issue with something I have said. So really, like, super lucky. But I did have a parent come up to me once and say, "I don't understand why you're making my son use the word penis." I said, "Oh, what would you rather I what would you rather I say?" "Well, we call it a pee-pee at home." I said, "Well, okay, I can't control what you do at home, but I feel like in our class it's important that, you know, words have power. Omitting certain words from your vocabulary gives them more power, and not necessarily the good kind of power. And like, I want them to know that that's actually a penis is a penis. I don't care what, I can't control home, but I can control what happens in the classroom." And there's a reason for it beyond just me being annoying. And the reason for it is that if you think about bodies, not all experiences we have growing up are the healthy, wonderful, consensual ones, right? Sometimes we're injured or hurt. If we don't have words for our bodies, right, how do we tell our story? How do we identify what's going on if we don't all share the same language? Because someone's pee-pee might be someone else's something, you know, who knows, right? And it's really important that these words, that our young people know what these words are. But of course, you know, we'll come up against challenges with that all the time. And I'm sure some of you are going to say, like, why can't we call it a vagina? Most people call it a vagina. Well, I mean, you can, but I feel like it's my job to be anatomically correct. So for me, vulva it is. Okay. By the way, you should know that years ago, true story, I was training med school students. Just let that percolate for a second. And I was talking about the difference between the vulva and vagina. And one of them said to me, "Logan, do we really need to call it a vulva? Like, what's the big deal? It's pretty much the same." So before I passed out, I said, well, just out of curiosity, just because my wrist and my elbow are in the same vicinity as one another, like they're two different parts. Just because they're close, I'm not going to tell you that I broke my wrist if I'm talking about my elbow. Just saying. They stopped speaking after that. But I mean, it's just important to know. Sometimes, like, I get it. Sometimes we use what's available to us. But if we have an opportunity to teach and teach better, I sort of feel like we should. Okay, and private parts. So to me as an educator, I really struggle with the term private and privacy, especially as it relates to bodies. And the reason for that is, selfishly, you know, when I walk into a classroom with 5th graders, 6th graders, 7th graders, and for 10 straight years they've been told these parts are private, you know, when I walk in, I'm like, guess what we're going to talk about today? All the parts you've been told we don't talk about. They can't do it, right? It takes them so long to get past that discomfort because for years they've been told we don't talk about these things, they're private. Now, I would rather us talk about these parts as being personal and personal to you. They're parts that are for your pleasure. You have the right to them and to make decisions for them. But what happens is, and I think that this is why the word privacy challenges me so much, is because with young people, and if you work with them long enough, private becomes synonymous with secretive. And it's hard to distinguish between the two. So when they do have questions about these parts or something has happened and they've been told over and over again, we keep this secret, they don't know how to talk about them, even if it's to their own detriment. So it's just something to think about. I'm not going to like come into everyone's home and say, you can't use that term. But just important to remember that when we're explaining this, you can talk about privacy without it being synonymous with a secret. Like these things are for you. But if you have questions or concerns, you should absolutely talk to us. So these are the common concerns we talk about from 0 to 5. So I want to sort of pose this to you. So I'll read through the list. Then you tell me how you think you would manage this, with a client if a client was concerned about this. So, excuse me, masturbation, playing doctor, co-bathing with friends or siblings, co-bathing or showering with, parents and older caregivers, a child who's constantly touching or groping at your breasts or genitals, a child who walks in on their parents having, some sort of sex, or a kid dressing up in the stereotypical clothes of another perceived gender. How do you think you might handle any of these issues?
Well, most of them are consent issues.
Okay. Well, right. So you can focus on the fact that, were both of you okay with whatever it was that you were doing?
Yeah, I saw you do another lecture. It was actually really good. I put the two together. Like masturbation using. My friend Lindsay has a 5-year-old, and he's constantly touching his penis. And I always say the parents have Tourette syndrome because she's like, Orion. And she was talking about him touching his penis, and they said, Lindsay, why don't you teach him consent? You're not consenting to being, seen.
A part of it.
So he needs to do that in a place where he can get consent, where he can obtain consent, which would be in the bathroom,
right,
in his bedroom.
Yeah. Totally. I mean, a lot of these are about consent and rethinking that consent isn't just about doing something with someone else, but just the fact that someone is around you, they may not have consented to that. Now, I will say, both personally and professionally, that really until the age of 4 or 5, you can say please do not touch your genitals at the dinner table a million times. It's highly unlikely that behavior will change. After 5 it becomes a little bit easier. But it's a conversation that we can change sort of the tone that we give around it, right? So it's really easy for that to become something shameful, as opposed to saying, hey, I totally get it. Your body's super cool, but we all didn't consent to be a part of it. This is for you. We don't need to be here for this. If you need some time, cool, go to your room. Totally. Playing doctor. your clients will get calls at some point like, I found my kids and your kids naked, right? Like that happens. And the question really is, how do we deal with it without making kids feel badly? How do we talk about it as being, well, look, you know what, the reason you can't do that, not because you're not super curious, but because I need to get another parent's consent. Not every family is comfortable with people being naked, right? We are, or we might not, whatever the, family values are, but, I need to make sure everyone's on the same page. So it's totally cool to be curious. I totally get why you're curious, but because it's someone else, I have to make sure it's okay.
And Logan,
Yeah.
question. Let's say you do, right? So you call me and I say it's totally fine, they can be naked.
Mm-hmm.
At what point and how do you talk to them about, obviously consent between the two, but also how much is too much? What are your suggestions? So,
it's interesting. I mean, I think that I would say, it's really cool, like everyone is comfortable with nudity, but when it comes to bodies and touching our bodies, like we're responsible for our own bodies, right? No one is allowed to touch us without our permission. We can't touch anyone else. Here's the thing. There are times when kids are going to touch each other, right? And it's going to be consensual. So I think I know what workshop you're talking about, but I may have shared this story years ago. But I had friends whose sons used to bathe together, right? And they would do this thing where in the bathtub, and it was my girlfriend had come in, and the two boys were in the tub, and they were both like, they were touching each other's penises, and the kids were like, look, my penis got strong. I mean, super cute, right? Like, strong. And she didn't make a big deal about it. And her partner came home and he freaked, right? So, it said, they're never bathing again, no more, never. So she came to me and said, well, do you think we handled that wrong? I said, might have done it differently. You're only comfortable as adults or your clients with what you're comfortable with, and that's fine. It's fine if you're not comfortable with those things. The question is, what can we do to curb certain behaviors without instilling guilt or shame about them, right? So instead of saying like, you are not allowed to touch each other or see each other naked, how about, listen, you know what, we don't have a lot of time before like we have to finish our homework at dinner or whatever it is, and clearly you guys play way too much in the tub and you're not getting like, we got to extend the night later on, so everyone's going to do quick showers from now on and move on. And that way, at least it's not like you touched your brother's penis and that's a problem, right? That's a big difference. Walking in on parents having sex. You know what will happen? That. This will come up again when they're 6 and 8, when they're 10 to 12, when they're 15 to 18, maybe when they're even older, right? This happens. This is more about like what they are seeing, what they think they're seeing, rather than, it's hard from 0 to 5 to teach privacy, right? You want to say, knock on the door. Again, a little bit harder to do. I mean, I will absolutely tell you that it has happened to me. My daughter must have been 3 at the time. I turned around to my side and all of a sudden, 2 little eyes are staring right back at me, elbows closed. I screamed, my partner screamed. She just looked at us. I'm like, hi, everything okay? To which she said, my brother will not get my breakfast, right? Did not care at all what her parents were doing. She just wanted to be fed, right? So it could easily go that way, or it could be like, oh my God, I heard yelling and I thought someone was hurt, right? Could have been either of those, but it will happen, and it's really in how we handle it. Instead of saying get out, because that's the guilt and shame way, right? Just to acknowledge what, are you okay? Tell me what you think you saw. Let me understand more. And then of course the gender piece, right? The wearing clothes, dressing up. I don't know any single person whose kids at this stage didn't play in stereotypical clothes or things of another gender. I don't know anyone. In fact, it makes perfect sense to me because if you look at clothing stores that are typically laid out for kids, the boys section, I'll use that in quotations, the boys section, is sad and depressing.
Yeah.
The girls section is like glitter and unicorns and neon and rainbows and is awesome, right? Now, by the way, but not awesome if you're like not a stereotypically feminine girl. Then it's like, oh, another one of these unicorns and rainbows. But, you know, I get it. We are totally curious about the things that we don't have access to and that aren't given permission to explore. So, you know, exploring this stuff doesn't mean anything. Could it? Possibly. But oftentimes we like to play with things we're not used to playing with, that we're not given, right? It's why, like, I remember my cousin's He-Man set that all I wanted to do was play with the He-Man set. I did not have the He-Man set. I begged for the He-Man set. I did not get it, right? Times were different. Okay, so just to, I showed this in the, yeah.
Sorry, I want to go back to kids walking
Yes.
and having sex. Because I talk about this a lot with my friends, my clients, you know, and I mean, one thing you said is they could be scared or they could just be curious and say, what are you doing? Right? How do you suggest, because you don't talk about age appropriateness, but it's appropriateness based on what they can understand, the language, etc. Right? I mean, I know you
Sure.
appropriate. What word do you use then? You don't like appropriate.
I don't think there's
Language that they-
I don't think there's a replacement, right? I don't think there's like another synonym.
Using language that they can understand and comprehend that they, you know, at their maturity.
Yeah. So sometimes I would say the same way that like whoever I'm with, right? Because it may be a parent, it may not be, you know, this is the way that sometimes grown-ups show love for one another, right? And you know, this is the way that we as grown-ups can share love for one another, or you know, whatever word you want to use if it's not love. You know, but if you have any questions, I want you to ask me. Right? It doesn't have to be long and drawn out because then it becomes a bigger issue, right? So sort of like, what do you think you saw? Meet them where they are. I mean, for my kid that didn't even, whatever, just feed me. Like I'm not interested in whatever's going on here. I want cereal, right? It depends. And every experience is going to be different when it happens. You know, a 7-year-old walking in is going to be different than a 3-year-old. You know, a 3-year-old has immediate needs. A 7-year-old is a little bit savvier. These were, this was a website, and obviously it wasn't a deliberate one, but people have gone out of their way to make silly things to curb behaviors that they think are inappropriate. I'm showing you these because these next 2 slides, just so you know, I was asked years ago, someone was going for nursing training and she had seen me speak before and she called me and said, I gotta tell you, I'm really uncomfortable with the materials they're giving me. I said, tell me why. She said, I'm gonna screenshot 2 things for you. So, one of them it is under age inappropriate behavior, there's that word inappropriate again, sexual language, play, or other behaviors that are not age appropriate include seductive or masturbatory actions. Masturbation, is it like as something that is age inappropriate behavior? I mean, we saw like, you know, fetuses without deliberate like conscience masturbate. It's not about age, it's not about sexualization. And also, yeah.
But is it about agency? So when you're doing something without knowing what you're doing versus knowing something when you know what you're doing, is that the cutoff?
Well, but in this case, so even with young kids, if I'm touching or rubbing my genitals, I'm doing it deliberately because I know it feels good, right? Because I have that part.
But without knowing kind of what that means, that's more animal, right? But the difference between animal and human, I mean, you're cognizant of this is what it means. Is that the cutoff?
Well, but I think that if kids know that something feels good and know what it means, I don't think that's a negative. I mean, in fact, I would even go so far as to say, when we know what our own bodies are capable of by ourselves, we wind up not having to feel that validation from someone else who may not be a healthy partner later on when we know what our bodies are capable of, right? So it's not a negative thing. No, I know. I work, yeah.
What it means, understanding the perception of others, if they understood that you're doing what you're doing, Because that's the other level, right? It's not about what you're doing, what it means, it's about what it means to others. That's where the shame and guilt comes from, right? It's not necessarily a self thing. It's
Sure.
being seen by the outside based on what you're doing.
I mean, yes, that's certainly where shame develops, but I don't want anyone to ever think that a kid who's touching their genitals, like that there's something pathological about it, right? Which is what this was coming, was coming from.
I'm thinking about the kid themselves, not about others. I mean, others
Yeah.
think based on whatever. But
So what?
themselves.
So say it again. So that.
At what point, when they mature, at what point does the kid understand like this is something that I shouldn't talk about, shouldn't do in public, shouldn't? Because there's it's the perception of others and the judgment of others.
So interesting, right? So I think that, I mean, we set them up as adults in their lives all the time. Like we make things really clear that certain behaviors, there's that word, public and private again, and that bodies are just for you and not to be shared with everyone else. But the other thing to remember too is that, look, I also work with a lot of kids who, have all sorts of, learning differences and styles, and some have compulsive behaviors. So I think it's important to remember that like this standing on its own is not a measure of whether or not something is going on. And this was followed up by, this inappropriate knowledge piece, which was, knowledge of sexual acts. A small child should not be able to detail what happens during sexual intercourse. Which, and again, this was coming from like a nursing education program so that nurses could identify signs of potential abuse. But I spend my whole entire life getting people to recognize that, like, what's really common for a 3-year-old to ask? They see people around them that are pregnant, and what do they want to know? How are babies typically made, right? So, like, makes perfect sense for them to know because that's what they see, right? It's whether or not we give them factual information or not. And it gets back to filing away, like, this problem with age appropriateness is like some teenagers will giggle and make a big deal, and some kids are like, oh, I don't really get why you would do that, but okay, file it away. Okay, 6 to 8. They socialize, primarily with their own gender, and there's a fairly rigid separation, again, based on certain stereotypical expressions. They can recognize stigma and taboo about sexuality. They start to get less likely to ask questions of adults. They can understand more complex ideas and understand that sex is more than intercourse for the purpose of procreation. They will look to other sources for information. They start to understand stereotypes. They may and do often, explore same-sex or same-gender exploration, which may or may not have anything to do with how they identify their sexual orientation. Oftentimes we experiment first with the people who are close and who feel safe to us. And if we're solely socializing with a particular sex or gender, not a surprise. And they have a stronger self-concept in terms of gender and body image. So years ago in 2011, this was this for me was like the gift that keeps on giving in terms of media, like sensational sort of, the word is escaping me right now, but this blew up in the media, and all of a sudden every like outlet for pop culture and news media, like hard news media, was talking about this. So if you don't know or don't remember, this was an image that came from a J. Crew catalog, and this was the executive creative director at the time, Jenna Lyons, with her son Beckett, who I believe was 8 years old, and it said, if you can see the pink toenail polish, "Lucky for me, I ended up with a boy whose favorite color is pink. Toenail painting is way more fun in neon." Now, admittedly, I thought this was the sweetest thing because my son's toes were painted neon pink. We had just done them. And I thought what was super cool wasn't just that like a kid was having his toes painted, but also it was like an interesting different dynamic between a mother and son. And within like days of this, because obviously 9 years ago was different in terms of, the internet, well, a talking head on TV, a psychiatrist came out and said that this was part of an insidious agenda to make people transgender, and that boys who paint their toes and would like pink are going to want to become girls. By the way, as if it were that simple. Now, obviously we chuckle because that sounds like the dumbest thing alive. Like, how ridiculous, like, oh, I'm going to put on a pink shirt, all of a sudden I'm going to want a vulva and vagina, as if that's the thing that does it. But what happened is that every outlet picked up on this discussion and debate. Instead of ignoring it and saying this is ridiculous, there was actually a public discussion over, could this be accurate? Like almost legitimizing this insanity. So it's important to remember that we have a lot of questions about that with young people, it's in particular around this age. Like, what will it mean for them, instead of just saying, oh, they like pink?
I mean, in the 1950s, Congress had this big thing, right? Batman and Robin, homosexuality,
Yep.
and tagged with each other, right? That's on one end of the spectrum. But painting your toenails pink as a boy, like, I mean, I could never imagine having any of my boys do that. That being said,
Yeah.
they all had long hair, all of them. And, you know, culture kept, you know, they're girls.
Sure.
So we all have our own kind of markers. I mean, for me, I wouldn't be comfortable with my son wanting to paint his toenails pink.
Yeah, but what?
Would not do it.
But would you think that if your son painted his toenails pink, that he would want to be a girl because of it?
If you want to do it every day, maybe. If you want to do it once, try what it's like, and just let it go? No. So, I mean, so there's that, right?
Sure.
So,
Well, I think it's important to remember that, you know, culture certainly comes into play with all of these conversations and expectations, and depending on where you are in the world, our gender stereotypes and gender expressions change. The one thing I always want to remind all of us, and in particular young people, is that colors don't inherently have genders. Makeup doesn't inherently have gender. Clothes don't have a gender, right? Like, we label them a certain way. Right? So it's that stuff that I think it's just important. I never want people to feel, you know, guilt or shame about liking something or wanting something, because sometimes we just like stuff, right? And like in that moment, that's how people want to express themselves. Truth be told, I know a lot of boys who have come to school for a variety of reasons with all sorts of like nail polish and toenail polish, because again, often it's about like, I'm never given these things. I wonder what it would be like to see my toes like that. Right? It's less about like wanting to be like another gender and more about what is it like that this thing that everyone makes a big deal over. Right? I know a lot of boys, like for example, who absolutely love the pedicure experience. Right?
Me. I love that.
Yeah, I mean, and again, it's
I go once like every 2 weeks.
and it's because there's touch and relaxation, and there are things that. So again, wherever we are, I think it's important to be okay with where we are, but also to recognize that, like, if we're uncomfortable with things, we find ways to deal with them so that we don't put shame and guilt on someone else.
and to the point earlier about kind of, you know, with my boys.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm you know, the Seinfeld had the soup Nazi, I'm the sleep Nazi. There are two things that I'm leading with everything. Two things I'm leading to: number one, sleep. Number two is sleeping outside the house. And I'm very strict. Like, until they're bigger than me and I can't argue anymore, and I have three of them who are bigger than me now, then okay, you can sleep wherever the hell you want. You know? But because stuff happens and you don't know who it's going to, and like, even like at my parents' house, like if I have to be away traveling with my wife, I'll tell my mom, okay, they can come over, but no one else can be in the house. Not because I think their cousin can do anything, but because of the work I do, the stories I hear. You know, so I just don't want to be in a situation where I'm kind of worrying what's going to be happening with my kids. So I educate at the same time. People are people, and things happen, and you have to kind of really be kind of just comfortable with, you know, what your, you know, what might happen and what you can be not feel guilty about later. So for example, even in the situation I created, things might still have happened, but I'm not going to beat myself up about it because I've done the best that I could for them. But for me, like if I had a son who told me I'm gonna paint my fingers pink every day, I mean, I'd be worried about him. I wouldn't be upset at him. I'd be upset for him.
So here's the interesting thing. So for me, I really try to make sure that our kids, the bigger hour, really develop resilience, right? And understand when they make certain decisions that if they are like defying the tradition or the stereotype, that they can verbalize why they want to do it and be cool with it. And if someone says anything to you, how are you going to respond? And that they have that script for saying, hey, I like pink. right? Or whatever it may be. You know, the other thing about, and obviously everyone's family dynamics in terms of sleep outs and sleepovers and everything, and admittedly, I'm on the other extreme. My kids go to sleepaway camp for 8 weeks over the summer and have for years now, and I did too. You know, again, family structures, everyone is entitled to have their own family structure. I think the one thing I'm always cautious of in any type of dynamic is that we don't create like the boogeyman, right? Because we never want young people to sort of go through the world afraid of what's lurking behind the door instead of feeling like, you know.
Because it's not the boogeyman that's the problem. It's the person who you never identified as the boogeyman. That's going to be the problem.
Well, but any of that, right? Even the people in our life, as opposed to giving them the skills to, you know, to know that they have the right to certain things, and to give them the toolkit so that if something ever happened, you know what to do following that. But not the assumption that things will happen. It's, you know, the world is a positive place.
But the world here see, the thing is, you know, when it comes to transgressions against children, that's the same no matter where you are in the world,
Mm-hmm.
right? Difference is, in this part of the world you have laws. In my part of the world you don't,
right,
necessarily. And so things keep happening, but perpetrators really get away with it. And you have situations that, you know, it has long-term repercussions. I mean, I see it in my clinic. So it's a terrible kind of balance.
Yeah, and again, yeah. Do you want to say something?
I was just thinking about how, look, there's violence between siblings, you know, so like it can be within your own family where one of them decides to be a perpetrator. And so if each of the children understand, you know, I own my body, I'm the boss of my body, etc., and you can't touch me and all of that, it goes even to a family member. So that's the boogeyman could be anybody, but it's about resiliency and about like that kind of a thing there. I just was thinking about that.
I just found
you protect about all outsiders, but it's usually this person closest
right.
to you that's.
The people who are the most paranoid are the ones who get most taken advantage of, right? Because they're always paranoid about that thing, but the thing that the person that takes advantage of them is the person they're not paranoid about, right? So the paranoia really helps. So this idea that, you know, the boogeyman, there are boogeymen for sure, but the boogeyman that's identified is never the one that actually ends up doing anything, right? Because you focus on that thing or phenomenon, not.
But will you talk about safety for kids? Yeah, a little bit about like, or how to help at different ages, or.
Well, I think that you know, so much of this comes from when you teach kids names of parts, that they have agency over their own bodies, that they have certain rights, that they have the right to a voice. You know, all of those help young people develop the skills to speak up when they need to speak up. Now, that doesn't mean they always will, but the question is, have we given them resources to come to us, you know, if there has been some sort of violation? Right? And that's, I think, the key. We cannot protect all people from everything, but we can do is build confidence to know that if something happens, that they have an outlet, they have a system of help for them, right? So, you know, and this was sort of we went in a different direction for a minute, but I want to remind all of us when we start talking about sort of different gender expressions that may not fit the stereotypes or the patterns, that, you know, oftentimes because parents don't have the language the same way like kids at school do, where like they can use they and their pronouns really fluidly and it's not a big deal and it's the coolest thing to see. You know, oftentimes we need to remind parents and caregivers, you know, if you have questions, you can ask and you can sit down and say, listen, you know, I'm wondering, you know, what's going on, you know, this is who I am. Tell me how you see yourself, right? And listen and pay attention. I will tell you that I know families whose kids have clearly identified as agender, who use they and their pronouns, and the parents refuse to use them. Refuse. Everyone else uses them, every other friend, school system, family will not. Right? So it's about who's the support system, who's listening, but really encouraging parents that, like, you know, if you want the best for your kid, you have to let your kid be who they are in that moment. Right.
Is it that they just don't know how? Like, it feels weird versus saying, like, they're so used to him and her. So like saying they shoes, instead of like saying like her shoes, saying they shoes.
Their shoes.
Their shoes.
You know, it's complicated. I don't know the official reason. I think that oftentimes, sometimes parents and caregivers say, you know, the kid doesn't know who they are yet, so like we're just going to keep using what we're used to until we're sure. As opposed to like being fluid the way young people are and acknowledging, okay, you know what? So maybe the pronoun changes a year from now. Okay, so we'll change it, right? Like let's listen to what a young person is saying. Be respectful of that, and if it changes, okay, what's the big deal? So you change your pronoun again. Like, is that too much work? Right?
Well, for people
Yeah.
in Indiana, small town Indiana.
Right. Sometimes it is.
Yeah, I remember like when I was growing up, I was like in the Marilyn Manson, and I would like take my sister's dresses and like wear the inside, and everybody's like, he's wearing a tutu. And I was like, I'm not wearing a tutu. But like I would like shave my eyebrows and I'd steal my mom's like, and they wanted to like remove me from school, and my mom's like, why has he done?
Right.
And they're like, no. And I mean, I don't know. I just think it's it's like the panic of, oh my God, my kid's gonna like maybe not be as, you know.
Instead of saying,
as we thought he would.
well, and instead of saying like, okay, listen, not everyone is going to be fabulous to my child, but how do I give my child the tools so that they feel like when they meet adversity that they have a language for it?
Yeah, and it was kind of a phase, but I don't know. I think you just let kids go through their
Phase,
stuff.
sure.
And you just go, okay, so it will, like, maybe it will, maybe it won't pass, it probably will.
Well, and I think the phase thing is really important for everyone to remember, because oftentimes we don't think back to our own lives and say, did we ever have a time, and maybe it wasn't like pushing so far out of what was typical that like we see it that way, but like I remember I had 3 years in a row. One year I wore my grandfather and my father's blazers with jeans and cowboy boots, because that was an in thing. I'm just saying, the cowboy boots. I grew up in New York. It was not Texas, but I wore men's jackets every single day for a full year. The next year I dressed head to toe in black every single day for a full year. The next day I wore my mother's old like kilts from high school every day for a full year. And really, and I had each of those phases because I was so desperately trying to figure out who I was and what my thing was. You know, and I think a lot of us have that, and oftentimes we don't ask, like the adults, you know, did you ever have a time where either you felt like you expressed yourself differently or something prevented you from expressing yourself the way you wanted to express yourself? And if that's the case, what would you want to do differently for your own kids? All right, so the older kid with the door. So again, sometimes it's about saying, tell me what you heard. Sometimes they are upset if they walk in on people because they're noises they don't understand. Maybe it's nudity that they're surprised by. I like to say that in general, this is a really good time when we start teaching young people about respecting a closed door and knocking, right? And that sort of goes on. Like if a 14-year-old walks in, right? The horror that they feel, and you're like, well, listen, you saw the door closed. You did knock, that's on you. I will respect your closed door, please respect mine. But again, it's a very similar, similar to when they're younger. It's just about, what do you think you saw? Sometimes they'll just walk right out, they realize like, I'm not welcome here right now. And that's okay, but it will happen. It's all in how we deal with things. If we pretend like they don't exist, that's not always the most helpful thing to do. Hey, what's up? And if they can't look you in the eye, they probably saw something. You got to do a little reading of body language. From 9 to 12, they have an emerging sense of self as a young adult. They are very conscious of their sexuality and how they choose to express it. They understand jokes with sexual content. This is the time where if you are living with people who have testicles and penises, anytime someone mentions the word balls, there's like a fit of hysteria every time it happens. They are very concerned about being normal. Is my body developing in the right way? Is it normal to masturbate? What happens if I have a wet dream? Are my parents going to be upset about it? No joke, I've been asked that many a time. I'm like, I promise, if you are of puberty age and you have a penis, your parents or caregivers know that at some point that might happen. I promise. They're very anxious about puberty. They become super shy of asking caregivers and the adults in their life questions, and there's like a lot of bravado about how much they know. I'd like to talk to you about something. I know that already. They don't, but they think they do. And they value privacy highly, especially because their bodies are changing. They're trying to figure out who they are. They're trying to make sense of who they are in their own skin, let alone what you are seeing. But this is also a time of flexibility about privacy too. So, you know, these are the same young people who may, right, leave their doors wide open and freak out if you walk by their open door and they're changing. But also sometimes strut directly through your apartment stark naked with all the windows open. Right? Like, I would love for young people to pick a lane and stay in it just to help us out, like have some uniformity, but they don't, right? So it's a matter of us just reinforcing, hey, whatever you're comfortable with, cool, but like, if you're not comfortable with me walking through, like, across your door and you left the door open, like, just close the door. It's cool. Like, I'm not gonna make you feel badly about it. I get it, no problem. But again, privacy goes both ways. So if I am gonna respect your closed door, please respect mine. Okay, so common concerns at this age is, when do we stop being naked in front of our children? What if I walk in on my child doing something, presumably masturbating? And how do we reassure our children that their development is normal? All right, let's talk nudity for a second.
Some cultures, they are nude all the time. Like, I know some families in Europe that are just like, they don't wear pajamas. Nobody wears pajamas in the whole family. Ever.
Which is like only an issue if you're cooking at a stovetop and it's like a low stove.
Like sleep stuff, like sleeping. Yeah, like pajamas, like, and then they're just all walking around, you know, using the bathroom, the hallway, or whatever. It's just,
yeah.
But they just, yeah.
You know, my theory on nudity is, if you're comfortable being like a family system that's naked, cool. If you're not, cool. Right? The only thing we don't want to do is, if we as adults or caregivers aren't comfortable, we don't want that to translate to like, I feel badly about my body and there's something shameful about being curious about bodies. Right? So there's a difference between someone walking in and you being like, oh my God, get out, right? Oh, than saying, hey, I'm changing, can you give me a few minutes? Right? Very different responses with very different translations. So again, whatever you're comfortable with, be comfortable with it, and that's fine. There are absolutely some families like where being undressed is a really common thing. Great, if it works for you. If it doesn't work for you, fine. The one thing I will say, and this happens a lot, is that around this age, this is the time where young people of this age will start making you uncomfortable about your nudity, where they will be like, oh, cover up, please. And again, the answer is, well, thank you for that. Perhaps you shouldn't walk in while I'm getting dressed if you do not want to see it. Right? So again, there's reciprocation to all of this. And again, like, I get it. You don't want to see me naked, but we could be a little bit more respectful about it. I like who I am. I don't want to feel badly. Right? The same thing you would want them to learn to say to someone. What if I walk in on my child masturbating? Oh, pardon me. I'll come back later. Right? And you can acknowledge the embarrassing situation or not. You sort of have to read it. You know, if a kid comes on and says, I don't know what I was doing, say, look, you're entitled to your space, right? I should have knocked. Right? That sort of like humanity, that we're not perfect as adults, goes a really long way. And say, look, you are entitled to that. I shouldn't have walked in. How do we reassure our children that their development is normal? Well, this is where things get a little bit more complicated. Because...
Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about pornography?
Pornography?
Yeah, if you walk in on a child and you're looking at pornography.
Yeah, totally. So we'll talk about it more later as well. So My issue with pornography, it's not an issue. Pornography exists. Pornography has always existed, right? It's important to think about how pornography gets consumed and how it's used and what its limitations are and if there are any opportunities that come from using it. My own theory is that it is super important for young people to be critical consumers of all the media that they consume, even pornography, which means that we need, if we see that our young person is using pornography, that we say, listen, you know, this is not, I'm not angry, I'm not shaming, I'm not yelling. I just want to talk to you about sort of that form of media and what it does and what it doesn't do.
So can we take that back to your first slide of being age appropriate? Mm-hmm. Right? Because you said you had an issue with things being appropriate and age appropriate. Is pornography age appropriate?
So here's what I think becomes, the word pornography in and of itself is a super personal thing. Right? Like what I might see as pornographic might be very different to someone else. It's like that fine line between erotica and pornography, right? It's very personal. I absolutely remember the first thing I saw that was pornographic. Absolutely. Second grade, my friend Allison had me come to her parents' house. Her father had a lockbox under his desk that we pried our way through and found a stack of magazines. Took me, by the way, years to find out that I was looking at a cervix. Just think about that for a second. Years. I'm like, oh, that's what it was. So I'm not surprised that we're curious about pornography and sexual things, and kids often are. I think I don't necessarily want a young person's first taste of what sex is going to look like to be in the context of pornography, simply because I don't want them to make assumptions that that's what all sex is. So, by the way, do young people get exposed to pornography? Yes. But I think it's in how we handle it. And to say, look, tell me what you think you saw. Tell me how you think that's real or not. How did it make you feel? Because oftentimes, one of the reasons a child won't talk to us about pornography is because it made them feel this feel-good reaction that they're feeling guilty about. Right? So some of it is us saying, and this isn't even like explicit pornography. Sometimes it's like watching a movie. Right, and there's something, and there's some kind of erectile or genital reaction. Yeah.
So kids now have smartphones.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm my God, we used to have a home phone, right? And now these kids, my, 8 and 9 years old, have access to this. I mean, they just have all this access. So I wonder if parents are basically handing this to their children.
So that's a great question. And one of the things that I promise comes later.
Okay.
No, later is sort of how we give things to young people. And I, by the way, think that therapists are in an amazing role to shape how we do that. So, and I'll share it later on, we gave our son when he was 11 when he got a phone because he was going to baseball practice by himself. And we needed to be able to reach him. We gave him a 17-point contract that we had drafted with all of our expectations over the phone. And we literally went through them one at a time and talked about why they were on there, right? But oftentimes, and this is a little segue for a brief moment, but oftentimes what happens is we give our kids technology with no parameters, right? We're like, oh, they'll know what to do.
Can you put, I don't know.
Yes.
A parent of a young child.
Yes, there are all sorts of things. Yes, I mean, look, they find their way around things. They're far savvier than we are. But again, if we're talking about sex and sexuality and bodies, and we're answering their questions as they come up, oftentimes they don't search information out elsewhere because they know they can come to us first, right? That doesn't.
Children. Your children, or are you just saying that's the way it should be?
Well, I'm saying oftentimes we search things out when we're not being given the information that we're asking or we're curious about, or we don't feel like it's comfortable to have these conversations at home, so we Google search them, which opens up a Pandora's box because they're typically not getting the answers that they want, right? And then if they have some kind of genital response, then there's guilt over it, oh my God, I like that, what does that mean, right? So I think that it's important that anytime, even in this window of early adolescence, even prior to it, when we talk about consuming TV, movies, graphic novels, advertisements, we teach them the skills. What do you think that's trying to do? My favorite advertisement, and not really favorite, but favorite from a discussion perspective. And again, because advertisements are just as valuable teaching tools as any other entertainment content. When Abercrombie and Fitch used to have the photography campaign where it was just naked people, in Times Square there was a billboard of naked people, right. Black and white photos. And I remember my kids and I going through Times Square and I said, what do you think they're trying to sell? They said, naked people. I said, they're trying to sell clothes. And we had this amazing conversation about, what makes someone feel like naked people helps to sell clothes? Right? And we've talked about the fact that not everyone's comfortable with nudity, and where do you get questions if you're comfortable? So I think that if we give them the skills leading up to it, not that they won't search things out, but we'll be able to have far more dialogues about it. I know I shared this in the last workshop, but when my son was 7, he came home one day, he had a play date at a friend's house, and he said to me, Mom, I think I saw something inappropriate on my friend's iPad. Now, again, we're not an appropriate word user, so I'm like, really? Interesting. What makes you think it was inappropriate? And he said, well, he showed it to me in his closet. I said, well, sounds like if he showed it to you in his closet, then maybe it was not something for the dinner table. I said, what did you see? He said, well, why would women jump up and down comparing their breasts to different types of fruit? Now, admittedly, the sex educator in me was stumped. I did not know about fruit porn. I had no idea. And so I said, I have to be honest. We're comfortable with nudity in this house. Some people are not. I said, and sometimes people look up things online when they don't have the answers at home. I said, but let me find out more. I said, hold that thought. Let me see what I can come up with. He said, okay. And so I did a little internet sleuthing. And what I found was that what they had been looking at was a public service announcement for breast self-exam. Okay? Now, I read that based on the description. That was fruit pornography. There was all sorts of things happening with the fruit. And it wasn't, right? So I think oftentimes when young people see something, it's really important not just that we try to find what they've seen, but also to get as much information as possible, because it changes the message. And then I went back, because again, the follow through is really important. And that's oftentimes what adults do. They'll stop a conversation and say, okay, I'll get back to you, without actually following up. The follow through is really important. So I went back and said, you know what, I found what you saw, and just so you know, it was to explain to women that it was important to check their breasts for self-exam, for breast cancer, and that breasts come in a lot of shapes and sizes like fruit, right? But we don't always do the follow through, which becomes really essential. And during adolescence, young people are so concerned with what's normal. Are they normal? Are we normal? Is my body normal? And that's really challenging, because there is no such thing as normal, right? The norms for one person might be very different than the norms for someone else. And this is a time where it's really important to explain that their path to growing up, body-wise or identity-wise, is not supposed to be the same as anyone else. So with that, I think that we should take a 10-minute break, because I think this will sort of set us up for later adolescence and beyond. So before we sort of move into this, may we discuss the question you asked? So a question had come up sort of about, in different cultures, for example, like with nudity, there are times when a kid goes into schools talking about the body-related, nudity-related habits in school, and all of a sudden, a teacher can be super upset, or making a certain assumption and bring in ACS, and all of a sudden it becomes a different sort of case. Has anyone sort of experienced this, or how have you dealt with cultural differences impacting the work that you're doing, or the reason why you're getting certain clients?
What do you mean exactly? I don't.
So do you want to share or like give an example?
Like, for example, I work with the Latino community. I get a couple of ACS referrals for different reasons. I've always been concerned with getting referral because of just like a cultural difference. Like, for example, like if a child goes to school saying, I saw my mommy naked or I saw my daddy naked, and then maybe it'll be assumed by the teacher that there was some kind of like sexual misconduct going on, and then I would get a referral, like what would I do in that situation? Like, how would I explain that? I guess I would have to like advocate, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think you would, so yes, I think in all of these situations, the advocacy part becomes so important, especially if you're gathering information. If it becomes totally clear that it just so happens that families walk around naked because nudity isn't a big deal, right? Then there's been no violation whatsoever. And this is often the challenge, right, with different cultural perspectives or religious perspectives, that someone else's interpretation of them becomes an issue. So the advocacy piece is so important, right? Gathering as much information to tell the story so you could fight on behalf of your client and your client's family. Any other thoughts or suggestions about this? Sorry, looking online.
And I'm not trained to know the signs of child sexual abuse. Would I have to refer the family to someone?
So that's a really good question. So I'm not a therapist. Rachel, can you talk a little bit about sort of like mandated reporter stuff as therapists?
Yeah, so I mean, is there a specific question, Priya, in terms of, I mean, obviously if they're telling...
If that situation happens and the family's telling me, look, nothing happened, we just happened to be this nudity positive family, I'm not trained to identify child sex abuse, so like...
And it's not yours to determine if there's abuse. You're only supposed to...
Well, I would agree with that, but tell me again, I'm sorry, I was responding to someone online real quick.
Like,
tell me...
Because like for ACS, we have to like, do reports
No,
and all
but what's
this
the
kind of
question?
stuff.
Is the question, how did you know that there was something going on?
Because like, let's say the teacher it was told by the child at school that, oh, mommy's walking around naked, and the teacher assumed like something was going on that was like misconduct, and now there's an ACS case referred to me.
You know, that's a really tricky question. I mean, yes, I agree with Pauline. You're not determined and, always err on the side of caution. I would say that you can call your insurance provider, and usually they're good about having at least somebody answer a question for you. If the extent of it was mom was walking around naked, right? That doesn't mean that some abuse happened, right? That means, did they walk in on their mom? So while you're not trained to do that, I would still ask for more information, and then I just call and ask your insurance provider to potentially talk to somebody. Usually you get like 4 free consults, and let them decide and just document.
But also, I think, in copious note taking and in discussions, right, to get a sense of like in what context is nudity taking place in someone's house, because there's a difference if like, people are all in the bath and shower together, touching each other naked, versus like, honestly, if I took the time to get dressed in the morning, my kids don't get fed. Like they would not eat because like it would take me too long. So I'm always in like various states of undress as I'm trying to eat, right? So I think it's about sort of getting that information and then going back and explaining, listen, in my information gathering, this is what I have come up with. And, again, this is where, and Priya and I we were just talking earlier, like we don't ever want kids to feel badly about what's going on in their homes, but it is important that our kids recognize that like not every family, the same way we were talking about playing doctor, not every family feels the same way. Not every family understands those things. So if you have questions, ask me first. Now there's a difference between if there's a violation, but like, the idea of like going into school and saying, hey, I saw my parent was walking around naked. Think of how that could be interpreted, and the fact that that could be an ACS case when it just so happens that people are comfortable with their body. It was nothing, right? So those things are super complicated, but I think that, get as much information as possible and just make sure that any sort of follow-up and guidelines are just, meticulously taken. I'm not sure that like fully answered your question. I'm sorry.
You can also
hard
call
question.
ACS
Yeah.
and talk to them directly, like, and just say, you know, I'm trying to understand about this situation. Is this something where, you know, I should have this be reported or not? Like sometimes, like they don't mind, you know, like actually like receiving a call.
I mean, but remember,
They really
teachers
don't.
are also mandated
Right.
reporters.
Yeah.
I mean, and I mean, if you have a release, like I'd be really, you know, I'd talk to the parents about it even, but I'd be really
Always.
curious as to what the teacher heard that they're concerned about, because from just that very blank statement, like it sounds like the teacher's got some, you know, her own issues.
And the parent, that's exactly
Right.
the thing too. It's like you call the parent and you say, you know, this is what's going on, and unless there's something where it's like this is what's happening to me or whatever, I've had a situation where it's like, you know, so your child's saying this, and then the parent will say like, well, that's not the case, or this is none of your business, or whatever. It just depends. And I say, well, we can meet together and roll call, you know, and then ACS decides, you know, if it's an issue or not. And it's not for me to decide. It's up for them to decide. Like if I get a defensive piece like around it a little bit, I'm just like, well, you can call. I kind of almost encourage the parents to call sometimes to make sure that it's clear and whatever, and that they understand if there's an issue.
Right.
Like that's another way of dealing with that.
And sometimes it's a matter of finding out what exactly the thing that was said was, right? Because that game of telephone
Yeah, now.
really changes like the intent, what was said, the language in which it was said.
But I also think teachers are notorious for going to school counselors and being like, this is what's going on, and you
Right.
can't handle it. And it's like, well, you can handle it.
Right.
You're
Well, and also, and again, sometimes things are done with the best of intentions, not recognizing that if you're wrong, how horrible that can be if you're wrong, right? I mean, it's like a teacher deciding, you know, what is my gut telling me? And not that they're always right, but it just means that it makes your work harder on the other end. All right, so 13 to 18, as we move into later years, understand that they're sexual and understand the options and outcomes of sexual expression. Do consciously express their sexuality in ways that include all sorts of sex behaviors. They can recognize components of healthy and unhealthy relationships, understand outcomes other than just pregnancy. They have the capacity to learn about intimate, loving relationships and have a greater understanding of their own sexual orientation. Though I will say there was a study that was just released last week that said that sexual identity is even more fluid than we thought up until one's 30s, that there are a lot of different categories. Assigned females tend to have more categories and a little bit more leeway with fluidity, which probably isn't a tremendous surprise, but that sort of fluidity of sexual orientation now happens far more into one's late 20s than one's early 20s. And part of that is also because as we are older, we recognize that attraction is not simply about gender or genitals. And that our culture has changed enough to discuss lots of difference in relationships and far more tolerance than before. So what do we think is the sex behavior that characterizes the majority of what teens are experiencing at any given time?
Normal. Mostly I think it's like fondling and not really like penetration.
So the answer is, at any given time, the majority of teens are masturbating. By the way, you should know that this is actually a real, I'm just gonna take these paper towels up to my room alone so don't bother me. This is from the Nickelodeon cartoon series, The Fairly Odd Parents. This was a real statement made in the show. That, now as an adult, I'm like, oh my God, how did I not pick up on that? So at any given time, the type of sex that young people are engaging in mostly is self-manual sex, masturbation, right? So all the headlines that we hear are not really reflective of the majority of youth in this country, but masturbation typically is. Our concerns start to change a little bit when our kids are clearly teenagers and a little bit more deliberate about what they're doing sexually. So questions arise around, what do I do if I walk in, not on like my kid masturbating, but like, what if my kid is with a partner and they're doing something? Like, what do I do about that? What if I find condoms or any other sort of like protection in their room? What if I think that my teen, not teen, is in an abusive or unhealthy relationship? And what if my teen asks to go on some type of contraceptive? Right? Those are all super common concerns at this time. You know, again, if you're walking in on someone, the likelihood means that you have done what? You have opened the door, right? You have not knocked, you have not respected someone's privacy if a door is closed. The other thing that comes up a lot when working with parents and caregivers is that they often ask, well, what do you think I should do? Should I allow a closed door in my home or not? Right? And that is a really personal choice with no right or wrong answer. Right? Your clients and all of you get to determine like the rules in your home. What's cool with you? And again, you can be, so here, my personal perspective is, as liberal as I am about a lot of things, you know, I don't necessarily want, when the time comes, my kids having any type of sex while they are in my house and I am home. And the reason for that is simply because I think that if you, for me, my value, if you respect your partner and the act of whatever it is that you're doing, that you don't necessarily need everyone else who's living in that home to know when you're doing it, right? That there's like a respect and sanctity of that act that like I don't necessarily want like their whole family knowing. But again, those are personal calls, and it's a matter of what are your rules and like what happens in general if a kid violates the rules that you have in your home, right? And you get to make those decisions. I would say if you find some kind of like condom prophylactic thing in their room, first of all, congratulations for having young people who are concerned about sexual health. Yay. And also important to remember that having a health product doesn't mean that someone is actively like using them for sex of any kind, right? It could mean a lot of things. They wanted the practice of buying them. Friends had them. Friend is sexually active and wasn't comfortable buying it. There's so much that goes into like that one image. If a teen is in an abusive relationship, what do you think we should encourage caregivers to do? Yeah. Talk about what you're seeing, you know, get a sense and also do some listening. Tell me how your relationship is. You know, I'm noticing things. How are you feeling? Like, how is this person treating you? Super important. And not come in hot, because what do we know from teenagers, right? When we come in hot, what are they going to do? Yeah, they're going to be like, don't tell me what to do. This is my person. I love this person. And I'm staying, right? Even if it's against all better judgment, right? So the dynamic here has to be, you know, let me listen to you, you describe for me, how can I help you, as opposed to like, you need to end this. And then of course, if a teen has to go on birth control, again, birth control doesn't necessarily mean someone's sexually active. There's so many different reasons why people choose to go on hormonal or LARCs, which we'll talk about, on contraceptives, right? And again, big picture, the desire to control one's fertility or some aspect of sexual health is not actually a bad symbol. It's a really responsible thing, things that we should encourage young people whenever they're making decisions. Okay, beyond that, whether we call it, you know, emerging adulthood or later adolescence, you know, physical and physical development tends to stop. They can understand outcomes. They test decision-making skills. Peer groups far less important than, you know, my own decisions. Yeah.
I just had a question. Do you encounter, like, specifically, like, PrEP is becoming more of a thing amongst, like, teens using PrEP? Like,
great question.
That conversation starting to emerge.
So for those of you who might not know what PrEP is, PrEP stands for pre-exposure prophylaxis, which is a daily medicine regimen if someone is at high risk of contracting HIV. So, or higher risk. Honestly, not as much, and mostly because in order to have access to PrEP, what do you need? Healthcare and money. Well, you need to be able to get it, right? So I think that there is starting to be increasingly more information, but it's still not a simple fix, right? And unless we increase access to these things, it still becomes super challenging.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, look, PrEP is a really crucially important option for a lot of people. Again, like, condoms are still the only things that are going to offer protection against other STIs as well. It's not a panacea for everything, but there's so much of an access issue with PrEP, right? Who has access to it? And the truth is, most of the people who are at higher risk aren't the ones who have access to it. And that is so painfully unfortunate and unethical. Okay. And of course, this is not just about me, this is about partner, this is about shared values, not just my own selfish goals. So the one thing I do want to mention is that the thing that often gets missing from traditional sex ed, as well as just in our conversations if our clients have kids or teens who have some sort of special needs or other kind of developmental disabilities, is that oftentimes these conversations are totally omitted from traditional sex ed, that there's no representation. We tend to make assumptions that all people with disabilities are somewhat asexual. And I mean, there may be, but the same way there are people in the general population who are asexual. It's not just about a certain group based on ability or not. Regardless of someone's cognitive age, biology is biology. Things happen to bodies at certain times. And everyone deserves information about their bodies. And then, of course, everyone has the right to have a happy and healthy sexuality. Everyone has the right to have personal agency and voice and to understand consent. When I work with different parent groups, this thing comes up often where if kids have some sort of special needs, parents often will delay these conversations instead of starting them early, where practicing a routine script of consent and personal agency becomes so important that it's something that we can develop recall for. So these are not things to push off. They're things that are important to discuss early on and not wait and not assume anything about someone's sexuality. So this last video I'm going to show you, and this is new, and this is also from Amaze, you could see that I'm really excited by this, is that this is actually the first, this was written up in Mashable recently because it is a video that has to do with teenagers talking about sexuality and disability. And while a question gets asked early on that where a young person asks someone specifically about their function, while that is not recommended, what it does in conversation is lets us talk about the fact that regardless of how our bodies work, right, we all have an innate sexuality.
Great, so I'll see you at 7.
Hey Alex, was that about Young Inventors Club? Tonight I'm unveiling my latest creation, the pizza taco. It's gonna be incredible.
Oh, sorry, I was gonna tell you. I can't make it tonight. I'm actually going mini golfing with Jillian Peters.
Jillian Peters, student body president, first chair clarinet and stage band, 5th level warlock on our ongoing medieval role-playing game. She is so cool. I didn't even know you were into that.
Medieval role-playing games?
No, dating. I mean, I hope it's okay to ask, but can your parts do stuff?
Actually, my parts work just fine. Just because I'm in a wheelchair, it doesn't mean I don't have crushes or feel attracted to people. In fact, no matter what our bodies can or can't do physically, people with disabilities have the same sexual and romantic feelings as anyone else.
And, like anyone else, people with disabilities have various sexual orientations and gender identities too. From heterosexual to gay, cisgender to trans, across a full spectrum of sexuality.
But are relationships more difficult for people with disabilities?
Well, regardless of my physical ability, I want the same things from a healthy relationship as everyone. Respect, communication, consent, and fun. And like everyone, I sometimes have questions about relationships. Like, how do I know if someone's interested in me? How do I ask someone out? Or how do I turn someone down if I'm not interested?
Putting yourself out there and trying to date can make anyone feel nervous or scared. But the more you educate and understand yourself and your own value, the better you'll get at feeling confident and making healthy decisions.
There are certain issues that people with disabilities could be more likely to face. Sometimes it can feel like parents are overprotective when it comes to dating. Or friends might not think of us in a romantic way because they don't understand that we have the same kinds of feelings. And there are some specific challenges that a person with disabilities might have to deal with. For example, if you had trouble communicating verbally, you'd have to find ways other than speech to express yourself or give consent, like using body language, adaptive devices, or pictures.
Think of it this way. Everyone's body is different and needs help from time to time. And regardless of a person's physical ability, they can have the same feelings, hopes, and dreams as anyone.
Thanks, guys. I think I get it now. Sorry I didn't understand before, Alex.
It's okay.
And you know what? I've got something that's gonna make your date with Jillian even more awesome. 1 New York style soft shell pepperoni and 1 hard shell deep dish bean blaster.
Thanks, but were those in your pockets?
Just since this morning.
Ew.
All right, thoughts? I mean, to me, I think these conversations.
I was trying to get the link.
I just think that the fact that we can have these conversations and show young people diversity across all spectrums, and that all of us have really universal questions and insecurities about ourselves, and how do I know if someone likes me? How do I turn someone down without hurting their feelings? All of that stuff is so central to being a human being, and it's not about ability. But I love the idea that our media is getting a little bit better at representing lots of different populations and really showing all of our audiences that we can see ourselves in something, right? Whereas oftentimes that didn't exist, certainly when I was growing up. So as we move into sort of the specific skills and issues that are facing beyond development, it is really important that as practitioners, we think about what our own values are and what we are capable and not capable of doing, and recognizing our own limitations. But also when we talk to our clients, to get them to think about if they're considering anything about their child's sexuality. What are your values? Have you thought about them clearly? And if you are co-parenting with someone else, are you on the same page? Because that's where things get super tricky if you're not on the same page. And oftentimes we don't really give ourselves the freedom to think about what it is our values are when it comes to young people. I often ask parents, I said, look, do you really want your kids never to have any sexual experiences until some magical arbitrary age and some like legal committed ceremony? And they'll say, no. I'm like, okay, so let's be more specific then. What is it that you want? Right? And what are the ways that we help our kids to get there? Right? Because that's very different than I'm going to say no to everything up until 25 and a ring or whatever that may be. So really to think about it and make sure that anyone you're partnering with is really on the same page.
Or even going a step farther, I mean, I still hear people say, someone's going to come in to pick my daughter up for a date, and I'm going to have my shotgun and let him know that, like...
Yeah, so admittedly, that is one of the things that drives me, just frustrates me to no end, right? This stereotype of an overprotective father with a daughter. Not that fathers can't be overprotective, but this idea that we have to resort to violence if there is, an interest in a person, the assumption that a boy is going to be predatory, and this assumption that a girl is devoid of sexuality until some magical time. The luxury of working with parents or caregivers is that they have the right to give values with facts, as opposed to me in a classroom, which I can't do. But it is really important that we encourage parents and caregivers to give facts with their values. So, the best example I can give is, remember all the old things that were taught about masturbation? What would people used to say? You go blind.
Kill a kitten.
Hairy palms, right? You can say you don't like certain things or don't believe in certain things. But you can't really lie, because what happens is At some point, our young people figure out that we have not told them the truth. And if you don't tell them the truth once, they really will not trust you again. They will look like they are listening, but they are really not, because they know that you've sort of violated that first question that they've asked you, right? And it's really hard to recover from that. And again, when we talk about balancing values with facts, especially with parents and caregivers, you know, the biggest question becomes, when did you first have sex? Again, whatever sex means. And this is when you have an opportunity to talk about the fact that there are lots of different types of sex. You know, is sex good or bad? Do you need to be in love? Right? These are the questions that are super value-laden that we often don't think about. And you can imagine what happens in the heat of a moment of a question. Sometimes we do this, and like verbal diarrhea everything. And then afterwards, once we've stopped talking, we realize, oh shit, that is absolutely not what I wanted to say. That is not the message I wanted to give. I didn't even think about it. I just like let it all come out and I didn't stop myself. So again, like, especially if you're working with clients, encourage them to think about these things. How might you answer this question? Think about it in advance. Or encourage them when they get a question to say, you know what, that's such a great question. Let me think about it for a little bit, like, because I want to make sure I'm giving you the best information. I don't want to just like say something and then regret it. I want to make sure I give you what you're asking me. So like, give me a little time to figure it out. You know, because all of these things are deeply personal. And again, not every parent, co-parent, partner might feel the same, in particular about like the kind of intimacy or love involved in sexual relationships. And no assumptions based on gender or orientation here, right? Like, people just have different values. So it's important that the values and facts get balanced and that we make it easier for young people to understand and not make it more complicated. I want to talk a little bit about gender as it relates to the information that we give young people. So, for example, when we talk about puberty and development, you know, is our information equitable? Or, you know, are we giving people different messages about how they are or maybe entitled to sexuality and pleasure based on what's between their legs? During puberty, most of what happens, this is what we call Tanner stages, and sometimes it's important to go back and remember, because if we haven't been in puberty or haven't had like people in our lives going through puberty, we tend to forget. You know, the Tanner stages are sort of the stages of what's happening overtly with respect to breasts and genitals that have to do with sort of how these parts develop. Now, I would just say this. One of the things that's really interesting, and every time I look at this image, I realize pubic grooming has changed tremendously. And what happens when young people's body hair comes in and it doesn't look like what they may have been told or seen in pornography or whatever it may be, right? So part of having conversations about development means acknowledging that the way people choose to express their body and their body hair differs, but that there is nothing wrong with how their body hair naturally is, and that information really should be universal, that it shouldn't make a difference what body part someone has, that we're giving them the same empowering information about their bodies. And reminding them that the way in which this happens, size, shape, etc., is different from person to person. Right? There's no one way to be you. This is a 5 to 7 year journey, unless you're on blockers, right? Which is different, postpones puberty for a while until you're taking different hormones. You know, but this is a complicated time, but you're on your own journey. And you're not going to look like the person next to you, and that's fine. The one thing I will say, and don't worry about the small text, is that oftentimes when I talk about puberty with young people, unless I'm specifically in a single-sex school where my options are limited, I really think it's super important that everyone is together when they talk, regardless of sex or gender. And the reason for that is, I struggle with this idea that we present puberty as something that is super different for everyone, instead of saying, wow, the majority of things that happen to everyone, regardless of sex or gender, and even the things that are different actually happen for exactly the same reason. We don't do that very often. We make ourselves so different instead of recognizing, wow, the human condition is really similar. And maybe we would feel more empowered about what was going on if we realized that it was pretty universal. So that is an important thing to remember. And again, if someone is intersex, and this is important to discuss when you're talking with young people too, that intersex people may experience puberty very different or might not even understand that they're intersex for lots of reasons until puberty, or if puberty doesn't happen the way they expect it to happen. I think we forget, by the way, this is from Big Mouth. Big Mouth is a show on Netflix. It's really not for children, though most teenagers have seen it. If you haven't seen it, there are parts of it that are hysterical and brilliant and parts that are horrifying. But it's about young people who are comedians, basically as kids going through puberty. This is the hormone monster, and he causes this poor boy to ejaculate very often at very inconvenient times, basically. But anytime this show comes up a lot in working with young people, because it is so explicitly about young people and development, even though it's not really designed for them. So we tend to forget that the purpose of puberty is what? Why do we go through puberty? Just to be grumpy for a few years? Just to annoy the adults that we live with?
Get to the other side.
Well, hopefully. But it's really to activate the reproductive system. That's literally the purpose. Right? The purpose is to give bodies options for reproduction later on. Notice I said options. I have taught many a class where I have had girls in particular say to me, wait, you mean I don't have to ever become pregnant if I don't want to? Right? And I understand why we do this, and I think my slide that I'm hoping for is next is not next, but it's really important that, that we remember that the hallmark of adolescence is sexuality, is expressing one's sexuality. We have come into this world where we now absolutely vilify the concept of teen sexuality and forget that that is actually all about adolescence. It's about figuring out who you are, figuring out who you might be attracted to, figuring out how you express yourself, how you experience things without crossing certain boundaries or things that you aren't ready to do. That's all about growing up. That's a really important part of growing up. That's also about how you deal with grit and resilience and rejection and all those feelings that give us the tools to become a functioning adult. But we forget that. And sometimes we make our conversations very dependent on gender, very unequal, and sometimes the messages we give are very dependent on the gender or sex of a parent or caregiver and that of a young person. So I don't want you to get super excited, but this is me in 1989, the hair, and my father and his bouffant. Multiple perspectives, if you have them available to you, is so important. I never want a parent or caregiver to feel like they are unimportant to a young person's development or experience simply because their experience was different, right? All of these perspectives are so important, right? All of them have value, and just because your experience isn't the same doesn't mean you shouldn't be having these conversations. They all help us to create young people who are informed, who have multiple perspectives, who understand how things are seen by different people and experienced by different people. This is a reminder, a brief word on affection. So, in particular, when we have a pubescent assigned female, and she has a male figure in her life, this weird thing happens where all of a sudden, said male figure stops hugging teenage daughter, niece, whatever. Why? Because the breasts get in the way. Now, of course, a young girl is like, I don't feel any different, but there's this weird fear that happens that if I hug them, what if breasts come up against my chest? Oh, what if? right? It's not a sexual thing, but that affection becomes so important still with young people. Otherwise, adults are sending the message that, you know what, you are different. I can't touch you anymore. I can't be affectionate with you. And that sends actually like the totally opposite message that we want to send. We want to send a message to young people that yes, their bodies are changing, but we still love them and adore them and want to help them to become, healthy, functioning adults, even though their bodies are changing. But sometimes we become physically distant from one another. And again, sometimes that's cultural too, right? The way we see developing bodies. But it's important to remind people that just because someone has breasts or pubic hair doesn't mean they're not a kid anymore, right? An 11-year-old with pubic hair is still an 11-year-old. Just because people look mature doesn't mean they're adults. They're still emerging teenagers. I spend a lot of time talking about sexual health, and one of the things I wanted to do for today was to get us to think about sexual health as something really big and broad. And so this is a model I've sort of created to help us contextualize that a little bit. So sexual health is physical, things we do for our bodies; emotional, how we take care of ourselves mentally; intellectual, what we know or what we need to know; and then there are the things that are external that are little, let's say, harder to control, right? The quality and context of our relationships with one another, culture, including not just, ethnicity, religion, culture, but also pop culture, media, technology, pornography exposure, and then politics, because whether we like it or not, whatever our perspectives are, things get done politically that impact people's ability to be sexually healthy and do certain things in certain pillars. So, with that, I want to give you a sense of how young people really understand their bodies, and is it really possible to understand bodies and be sexually healthy if you don't understand how they work? So, okay, this is obviously, the fact that you're not all yelling out what this is worries me. I'm just kidding. Obviously, penis, testicles, epididymis, vas deferens, prostate, seminal vesicles. Okay, assigned male reproductive system, great. Typically, when young people learn about puberty and sexual development, we talk about this, and inherent in conversations about assigned male puberty, we talk about masturbation, wet dreams, ejaculation, right? There's an implied discussion of pleasure in here, right? And we talk, when semen comes out of the penis, it feels good. It's actually a good thing. Erection, right? There is pleasure in the conversation, even if erections happen at inconvenient times. Now, let me present what happens in another classroom should everyone be separated. Wow, super exciting. Now, by the way, I'm not suggesting that these parts aren't important, but if they are the only parts we focus on, then an entire class is learning that, wow, if you are one assigned sex, you get to ejaculate. And you're just reproductive potential, right? Now, that doesn't exactly set us all up for, wow, I'm entitled to pleasure. My body has the capacity for pleasure. One is this, the other is like masturbation. Now, if you are me, as a young person, I'm seeing this, I'm like, okay, I get it. Menstruation, yeah, discharge, okay. Those aren't the parts I can see. I get it. Like, we're talking about penis and testicles and scrotum. You can see those. I can't see that. What does that mean for me? Nothing. Right? I want to know about the parts I can see. And I can tell you that when I was growing up, there was zero information about that. So, I suggest we do it a little more broadly. And it's important to talk about the vulva and all of its wonders. Now, the other thing that becomes really important is that we start to, and I alluded to it earlier, talk about really how similar we are, which means, and you really can't see it because the slide is so light here. So, the clitoris actually is shaped like a wishbone with bulbs, And the glans of it looks like a little penis. That's because in utero it comes from the same thing, which is called the genital tubercle. So every time we say, some people have penises and some people have vaginas, well, that's great, but that's actually not the same. It's actually some people have penises and some people have clitorises. So when we talk about puberty, is really similar actually for people. All of this that you can't see here is erectile tissue. The same erectile tissue that's in the penis, just distributed differently. So if we're going to talk about penises get erect, well, we should also be saying, wow, you know what? The clitoris gets erect too. You just don't see it the same way because the majority of it is behind the vulva. And that really changes things, right? Because all of a sudden, capacity for pleasure is far more equitable now. It's not just like, oh, you're entitled to it and I'm not, and I have to deal with my uterus. Right? It changes how we see things. But physical sexual health isn't just about protection. I mean, yes, it starts with understanding our bodies and how they work and how they change, but it's also about things like general health things, right? Not smoking or drinking, going to see a doctor regularly, exercise, taking care of your body so that there is function, sexual function. Getting tested for STIs or STDs, treating or cure ones that you have. Using protection and contraception. What's the difference between the two? Anyone know the difference between protection and contraception?
Contraception would be birth control, avoid pregnancy.
Correct. Okay, so contraception. Some of these are, my students are like, why is there an iPhone? I don't understand. I'm like, well, that's a fertility tracker, an app. Contraceptive methods only prevent sperm and egg from meeting, whereas protection is about preventing also any sexually transmitted infections, right? Which can be either external condom or internal condom. Anyone know why we use external and internal and not male and female anymore? Not every person with a penis identifies as male. So external condom fits over an erect penis, internal inside of the vagina. So it's important to know the difference because oftentimes we use these words interchangeably, and if we don't have all the facts, sometimes, especially young people, think that the product that they're using is going to do something that it cannot do. The other thing that becomes really important, especially for those of us who are professionals, and even within the sex ed community, this is an issue. Typical use versus perfect use for all of the products we talk about. Now, there is a book called Contraceptive Technology that has been around forever that talks about different efficacy methods of different products. This is often the chart. Sorry, I'm going to go back for a second. There is a chart that people use often in doctors' offices that talk about efficacy rates of different types of, in this case, contraception, right? Because there's no chart like that for the prevention of STIs. Typical use accounts for human error. Perfect use means if you use said contraceptive method as it was designed every single time, so consistently and correctly. So, this is the chart that we often give people, and we see implants, vasectomy, sterilization, IUD the best, and look at the poor, sad bottom. We have condoms at the bottom of this, next to diaphragms, which, by the way, like, I couldn't even tell you the last time I met anyone who's used a diaphragm in the last decade, but so be it. This is a real issue. It's a real issue because what we don't talk about is that the reason why the condoms are down there is because typical use rate for external condoms is 87%, but what it doesn't tell you is that that number includes people that say they use condoms but don't use them all the time. Okay, sit with that for a second. How is a product going to work if you don't use it? Well, it can't. It can't. Versus, like, if I have an IUD, how do I use it incorrectly? I mean, I can't, right? Like, if it's in my body, it's in my body as a doctor or a healthcare provider put it in. So it's really important to remember that this chart is so misleading, And it also explains to people, and including professionals, right, that if 87%, that means 13% of the time someone gets pregnant. No. All of these numbers are not out of 100, which also they don't tell you. These numbers are calculated by saying, out of 100 couples having vaginal intercourse over the course of a year, how many pregnancies are there? So that's actually out of more, like, I think the number in this case is out of 8,300. I think the estimate was like it was 83 times each couple. So really, I mean, the thing to remember is that when we just show charts without explaining them, it makes certain products, including the only ones that offer protection against STIs, seem really ineffective, when actually if you use them the right way all the time, they're 98% effective, right? If you don't use something, it can't work. So it's just important that, yes, I mean, we talk about the nuances of these things, but really explain. We can't just give charts because they're interpreted lots of different ways. Nothing can work if you don't use it. Okay, so how do we take care of our emotional, sexual health? Well, it starts with just being comfortable with who we are, with our identity, how we express ourselves, not being consumed by other people's judgment. I mean, think about how this plays out in your practice, right? Do these issues come up? Right? People who don't necessarily feel good about who they are, who have felt shame based on what other people have said about them or how they're supposed to express themselves. This is really challenging, but becomes fundamentally important to becoming sexually healthy. That we do things because we want to do them, not because we feel like we're supposed to do something or not based on someone else's expectations of who we are. One of the things I've become increasingly more troubled with in my own professional work is that all of my students ask me the following question. How do I ask for consent without seeming awkward? How do I ask for like a different type of touch without seeming awkward? How do I tell someone it's my first time without seeming awkward? There is such a desperate fear of awkward that makes me really sad. Right? I think in our swipe screen world, which comes with benefits for sure, we forget that vulnerability is, I mean, how do we have relationships without any relationship with a lowercase r? It doesn't have to be capital R, right? But relationships, connections, sharing bodies requires some vulnerability. Requires having some conversations that don't come organically to us, right? Especially, I mean, how cool are you going to sound talking about body parts that you've told were private and we don't talk about them for 40 years, right? Like that's not going to happen. So it's important that with the people we work with that we encourage them to talk about awkward conversations and that awkward isn't bad, right? Awkward is part of being a human being. Awkward and acknowledging the awkward tells someone else that you care enough about this experience that it's worth being vulnerable, right? So this is an important reminder for all of us that we're not as cool. We don't have as much prowess as as movies or TV shows or pornography model for us. That's not how things work. And that's okay. That's not a bad thing. It's a reality check though. Intellectual sexual health has to do with knowledge and skills. And obviously this gets into the political because sex ed, not everyone gets it. Not everyone gets good sex ed. A lot of it is awful. And when we talk about moving into those categories that are a little bit more, that are harder to control ourselves, I think that it's really helpful, especially when you're working with your own clients, whether they're young people or not, when they use certain words, to ask them, well, what does it mean for someone to be in a relationship? What does a relationship look like? Like, are the qualities we look for in partners, romantic or sexual partners, different than the qualities we look for in a friend? Like, do we have different sets of standards for both? And if so, why? And how's that working for us? And how do we model good relationship skills? Which, by the way, becomes really difficult if your clients are seeing you and they're struggling in their adult relationships. How do you model those things? And how do you acknowledge that you haven't been modeling them well so that a young person who's living there understands that, like, as grown-ups, we've made mistakes. I ask students a lot. This is my typical teenage healthy relationship workshop. I'll write on the board, would you date yourself? They'll come into the room and be like, oh my God, totally. I'll say, I'm not asking if you're hot. Great, you're all hot, congratulations. No, I'm asking you to think about, when you think about those like non-negotiable qualities that are important in a partner, not the superficial ones like certain body size or shape or eye color. I mean like the things that absolutely a relationship needs to have. Do you have those things? And if not, then maybe it's time to work on them, right? But are you the type of person that you would want to date beyond how hot you are? And that's a tough thing. That's a really tough thing. And obviously, again, I put this down again, what happens to our children when we don't model healthy relationships for them? So I always say that even though I've been in the sex and relationship space for a long time, I don't assume that I'm better at having a relationship with someone. I've been with my partner for, this summer will be 25 years. Hard to imagine. But one of the things that I do really well is that I know how to say I'm sorry. And I know how to hold myself accountable and take ownership of my shit when it's on me, right? I'm not better than anyone else, but I've gotten really good at saying, I messed up, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that, or I shouldn't have done it that way. And the other thing I do, and I make sure to do it, is that if I've done this in front of the young people in my house, I make sure that I model and show the I am sorry, I messed up in front of them, right? That they hear me acknowledge, I've made a mistake, and I'm taking accountability for it. And that becomes really hard to do, right? So how do you think you tackle that with your clients if they're not modeling healthy decisions? What are some of the tools you can give them?
So within the CBT rubric, one of the questions I like asking is, how is this helping you? Not as a right or wrong, but how is thinking this way helping you? What's your objective?
Yeah. So some critical thinking around that. And yeah.
At least I work with a couple of kids. It's a little neat. I use a lot of self-disclosure, especially with the girls. And whenever they come to me with certain issues, I'm like, I totally get it.
Yeah.
I was a teenager. It was rough, and they kind of connect with me that way.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think there's something really powerful for all of us, whether it's us in our own lives or encouraging clients, to acknowledge that they're human and we're not perfect and we make mistakes. And it's not about like never making a mistake again. It's about how do we reconcile making that mistake, right? How do we show people that we could do it differently? Or how do we take ownership of what we've said or what we've done and coming back from it? Because again, those of us in the field, we are not going to be perfect at these things. But hopefully we've developed some skills to acknowledge when we've messed up and let people know, you know what? I hear you. I get it. I made a mistake. So I wake up every day for this, not to support this, just so you know, to undo this, to deconstruct this. My belief is that everything wrong in our world comes from the double standard. It's the system that says that based on someone's either assigned sex or how they identify their gender, that we hold them up to different standards even if they do exactly the same thing. It's a system where like words like slut and hoe become like commonplace. And by the way, I'm not making assumptions that boys and men are the ones who use these terms the most. I would hold my female students equally as responsible, if not more responsible for this, because it's become one of those catchphrases where like if you want to feel better about yourself, you put someone else down and denigrate their sexuality, which is an awful thing to do. So my issue with this, and this is when I'm working with parents, I not only show them this, I show them this. This is what I found. My greatest hope for you is that one day you'll grow up to have lots of sexual partners. Oh wait, don't do that. I thought you were your brother. Right? And awful, clearly, well, for me it's awful, I should say. But sometimes caregivers, parents, don't even realize that they do it until they see it, and then they're like, whoa, I didn't think about that. Or I didn't think about how that might be interpreted. Like I might have done it with the best of intentions, thinking I was protecting my kid, but indeed I was not. I wasn't giving them that message. And for me, all of this this system, this paradigm that we use, first of all, assumes a binary, but also teaches us to mistrust or distrust one another before we've actually even had any single encounter with one another. So growing up, a lot of my friends were told, protect yourself from boys, they only want to get into your pants. Again, maybe with the best of intentions, right? But how do you internalize that? Oh my God, boys are predatory. Innately predatory, anyone with a penis is a potential predator. Now, are there boys and men who are interested in sex for the sake of sex? Sure, but guess who also is? Sure. So, but that discourse often is missed, deliberately or inadvertently. Also, it assumes heterosexuality, and this is a system where we blame victims. We say, what did you wear? As if a piece of clothing is going to magically make you do something with your body. It tells, and again, assumes a binary, tells girls and women and those who identify as that they can't have a voice and speak up about pleasure or protection lest they be judged, called an ugly name. It jeopardizes our ability to consent. It tells them that someone makes you sexual, that you are not sexual until someone does something to your body, and it has to be the right person under the right set of circumstances, right? Otherwise, that's bad too. And then, of course, it says to those who identify as boys and men that, guess what? You cannot be emotional or vulnerable. You have to want sex at all costs. Otherwise, we're going to question your masculinity. We're going to question your sexual orientation. You know, we make boys and men feel badly for emotional connections. And then, of course, you know, you have to be untrustworthy. Now, by the way, as someone who's raising 2 kids of 2 different sexes and genders, it makes me so sad that someone could look at either of my kids and make such gross assumptions based upon them simply because of how they're presenting themselves, right? And again, this is why we have so much trouble speaking up. This is why we're so quick to judge. This is why, well, boys will not be boys. Boys become the men we teach them it's okay to be. Right? And if we give them the tools to understand that they can want sexual pleasure and emotion and connection and teach girls the same thing, then we're creating a different paradigm for them. We're not doing a great job. We're trying. And then, of course, you know, this isn't just about, you know, you have to say no and you have to say yes. I think it's one of the things that I struggle with most is that so much of the consent is, how do we say no, how do we say no, how do we say no, how do we say no? Instead of giving young people the skills and tools to identify when is the right time to say yes? How do we evaluate, like, when is this like the right kind of experience for us? What do we need to be feeling? What do we need to be thinking about? What do we say? And the biggest thing, especially when we think about our clients, is that oftentimes the scripts that we use for consent actually start at birth, but because they're not explicitly sexual, we ignore them. We don't really count them as consent conversations. So, you know, I ask my students, when have you asked for consent today? And they'll be like, we haven't. I'm like, no, you have. May I go to the bathroom? May I get a glass of water? May I borrow your pencil? Right? That is exactly the same language as the language we use for sexual consent, right? And we have to either hear the answer, yes or no. And sometimes we're not happy with the answer, but we have to deal with it because the other person has the right to their answer, right? But we do it a lot, but often don't think of it as being consent scripts because it's not about bodies. But we do it at home too, and we should be encouraging it at home. So as soon as my kids, well, immediately, right? We talked about bodies, and if someone touched my body or someone else's body, we would say, did you ask for permission? You know, and sometimes, like if my kid says to me, may I touch your breast? I have said to them, there are going to be times I might say yes, and there might be times I say no, and you're going to have to hear and be okay with whatever the answer is. The same way if I say to you, may I hug you? You have the right to say yes, and you have the right to say no. Now, you know that when you talk about kids and parents and grandparents and all sorts of relatives, that becomes super complicated because older generations really struggle, right, with, well, I asked my grandchild for a kiss, I should get one, right? And it's hard for parents and caregivers to say, Yes, in theory, but we are teaching a little bit differently. We are talking about personal agency and having the right to stand up for yourself. And, you know, if we force kids to do things that they don't want to do, then they become teenagers and adults that just say yes because they don't feel like they have the right to say no. So I also understand that some of us have traumatic experiences in our histories that make these conversations near impossible to have with young people, right? It is really hard to talk about sex and development and relationships and consent if our experiences have not always been that way. So this is what I would encourage you to do, whether it was in your own home or with your clients, is that if you know someone can't do it, right, as much as they try, it is okay to have a proxy. It is okay for someone to have someone that they love and trust, who they know their kid or teen loves and trusts, that can be there to have those conversations if they can't. It's okay, right? And at some point, you might have to explain why you can't have the conversation, but it's okay, right? Far better to say to an aunt, I'd really love for you to have this conversation. I can't do it. I don't think I can do the job well, than to say something that you don't intend to say or want to say. Now, you know, technology complicates all of this, obviously. Gives us more opportunities to connect than ever before, but also presents us with certain challenges. You know, technology doesn't really allow us to own that awkward so much that I talked about earlier, because there's always a screen, there's always this barrier. We don't have to be totally authentic, right? We speak in emoji, which is great, but like, doesn't necessarily guarantee that I'm making the smiley face or like sitting there with my shades on, right? It's just a placeholder. And of course, also, you know, it just prevents us from having conversations face to face. Yes, it allows greater connection. It allows us to identify with lots of groups and diversity, and we find our homes and our communities, but it also presents certain challenges as well. So let's just talk about like the most obvious that seems to come up a lot. Sexting. Now, why do young people do this? I mean, why do adults do this? Why? No judgment. Why do we send naked pictures or texts or whatever it is that we're doing?
It's hot.
Okay, because it's hot. Because it's hot, because it turns the other person on. Totally cool. Why else?
It's about connection.
Okay, find a way to connect. Show someone you're interested.
But in a way, it's kind of anonymous.
Okay.
Is the appeal. You're not really having to take the risk because you're not in person.
So it's a way of expressing your sexuality without actually doing something physical with someone else, right? That's where it gets interesting, right? And that's real. I mean, that's really why young people do it. So it's because again, the hallmark of adolescence is in expressing one's sexuality. It's not a surprise that they want to do it, right? They want to like test the boundaries. They want to see who they are, see the response they get without actually doing the things that we say don't do, right? Which in this case is actual physical sharing of body parts. Yeah?
I have a legal question. So if if an underage child sends another child a picture or video image, and then they share it with one of their friends, is that
yes
soliciting child pornography? So fucked up.
Yep. So if anyone is underage, yes, whether you have it or distribute it, or pass it along, share it, whatever it is considered possession or distribution of child pornography.
Amongst kids.
You see teenagers getting into these situations all the time. Our laws have not caught up with technology. Our laws don't know how to distinguish between like, I sent this to the person I was dating, I wanted to do it, like we were all in on it, like with, you know, great legal exploitation, like cannot distinguish between the two. And that's really scary.
Do they really like take these kids and...
Sometimes, I mean, Depends on where you are, depends on the state. Oh.
And yes, absolutely, I've had people's children go to prison, jail, and get in trouble and be registered as a sex offender.
For the rest of their life?
For the rest of their life. And so I think that's why the conversation is so important to have, just the way you said it, Logan, in terms of the laws having come up. So the goal isn't to scare you, but to inform you that these are the things that could happen if you do. I mean, even if you take a picture, I think you said this, of yourself and send it, you're distributing child pornography.
Even if it's you doing it.
Even if you do it. You take a picture of yourself, you know, at the age of 15, 14, whatever, and you text it to somebody of the same age, because text is not secure communication.
Yeah, and here's the thing, and when I work with parents and caregivers, oftentimes they're like, oh my God, why are they doing this? And I'm like, listen, it's no surprise they're trying to figure out ways to express their sexuality and who they are. I had the 900 chat lines. Basically, it was like the AOL chat room, like where you got like the giant bill at the end of the month, right? And I said all the things that people are sending pictures of, I was describing verbally, right? The only difference was, and I didn't actually want to be doing any of those things, but I was just trying to find my voice and test it out. The only difference is it didn't have it was private. It was really anonymous. There was no way to get it back to me as an individual. It did not have the same legal implications that it does today. And all of the things I say to I always say to young people, listen, you know, I understand adolescence is all about testing and figuring out who you are. And honestly, it's about making mistakes and becoming resilient and recovering and figuring out how to do it different the next time. And the sad thing is you have lost the luxury of being able to do that. Because every time you do something with that phone, which is a symbol of freedom, right? Because you get a phone when you're independent, but it actually winds up containing you and your identity and everything you are in that thing that you cannot escape from. And that is so very sad, right? So for me, when we talk about sexting or sending nudes or whatever we want to call them, you know, my comment to young people is, I get why, but you have to know that the outcome of it is not something you can control. And if you can't control it, you shouldn't do it. Because this is the one thing, your being, your body, your identity, that you want to be able to control moving forward. You don't want that power in someone else's hands. Yeah.
So one issue I have back home is people who send the pictures, and the person that gets the pictures blackmail them into sexual acts. Does that happen here?
Yeah, I mean, sure.
Because of the shaming, because maybe
Yes. And it's never, right? And and none of it is okay. It's hideous.
Yeah, of course. But I mean, but again, so because it's very much of a shaming culture.
Yep.
It's not as reported, so it comes to my office, doesn't go to police, right? Whereas here, again, I mean, your laws might be behind, but they're, compared to the rest of the world, I don't think they're behind.
Rachel, do you want to, have you dealt with that? Sort of like the revenge.
But yes, again, if it wasn't out there, they couldn't use it.
Right.
So I use it as a learning opportunity, but that's also illegal. So I've seen people get in trouble for that as
right.
well.
Yeah.
And so in the meantime, you have to help people understand what could happen if it comes out, not in a fear-based way, but and if it does, then they have to go to the proper channels.
Yeah. So for me, I often tell young people to think about, why are we doing this? Are there better ways to show someone that we like them? Someone who respects you and you could feel safe with isn't going to ask you to put yourself at risk in this way. Because again, it's a risk to have someone else control you, right? Which is what this is. And the other thing is when we talk about sort of the anonymous sending nudes, dick pics, whatever it is that now when we talk about receiving any naked or sexual image, it's a sexual act and the other person may not have consented to it. Right. So there's a consent issue in it too. And oftentimes with young people, that's the way to get them to think differently. When they realize that if they send something that was not like asked for, it's a violation of consent. Because that they can wrap their heads around a little bit better than sort of like this idea that someone might call them a sex offender. Because it seems insane, right? That like a kid could mess up and you know, go to prison. So these are things we have to think of. I understand why young people do it. I think we just have to give them the tools to not shame them into not expressing their sexuality, but to explain that this requires trust of a system that is beyond their control. So again, small text. This was the example of my contract with my son. A woman by the name of Janelle Burley Hoffman wrote her own phone contract on Huffington Post, and then my partner and I tweaked it to our own needs. And so it includes things like super specific, because every time I work with parents, they're like, my kids will know not to send naked pictures. I'm like, no, they don't. You gave them a phone. They do not know. And by the way, their brains are still developing. So if you have rules for them, tell them what your expectations are. Also, like if you are paying for the phone, you have the right to check the phone. It's a very simple equation we have here. So, you know, like our thing says everything from as simple to, I will not ignore a phone call if the screen reads mom or dad. I will not walk down the street with headphones. I will not take pictures of myself or my friends doing anything without our clothes on, anything that would get us into trouble. I will not use this technology to lie, fool, or deceive another human being. I will not post pictures of people without their consent, right? Super, super specific. Now, by the way, if I was like redoing this for him now at 14 or 15 or 16, I might change this up, right? I might have him draft what he thinks is like a good model contract, and then we could sort of negotiate if the rules have changed or not, right? But they don't like organically just get it. They don't, because their world, people are sharing everything all the time, so they don't see it as something unusual or you know, abnormal. Yeah?
You might actually address it, so you want me to wait?
Okay, hold on. Yeah, maybe. All right, so here's the caveat to all of this, which is that if we are going to ask certain things of our young people, we need to follow it too. So what happens often in my work is that I will tell kids, like, before you post a photo of your friend on Instagram, do you get their consent? Most of the time, yes. Sometimes no. They're like, it's a birthday post. No. I'm like, outside of the birthday post, do you get their consent? Yes. And inevitably, this is what will happen. My parents post things all the time without my permission. So, and this is one of those great things with your own clients, especially adult clients. Like, if you want to give your young people the skills to ask for consent, hear the answer, and deal with whatever that answer is and be okay with it, even if they're disappointed, you have to model that too. So if you think you're really hot in a photo, crop your kid out of it if they don't want to be in the photo with you. Because they have the right to determine how they're represented. It's not just about like young people doing it, it's that we have to do it. And they will never do it if we don't do it with them. So this was actually a campaign that basically was with younger kids saying that like every time a parent posted like a naked picture of a kid, the kids were like, could you not please have my naked photos everywhere? Was that what you were gonna say?
No, but I'll actually private message people if I don't have their like numbers, or otherwise I'll text them when they post pictures of their kids, because they could actually get in trouble. Going back to our original conversation, they're posting a picture of their kid in the bathtub and they think, oh, this is so cute.
Right.
Again, Facebook's not private, so they can go to jail. You know, I mean, they can get in trouble.
Right, and that's back to that line, right? That fine line. What is erotic? What is like cute kid photography? What is considered pornographic? Like.
Problem is it's different for everybody.
You're right.
And
every state law is different.
Picture,
yep.
It could end up anywhere. I mean, the same way that you got this picture somewhere,
Mm-hmm.
that picture could, you know, like picture of your kid, and it also teaches people where your kids are at all times, what they do, what they look like, what, you know.
I know. Sometimes young people are far savvier than their adult counterparts.
For sure. And that's another thing, actually. So I work with a man, one of the places that I consult with, who is an ex-police officer. And he now has a company that does different types of training. Anyway, long story short, he talks a lot about parents monitoring their children's phones and talking to their kids, not doing it without them knowing.
Yeah.
But saying there's an app on your phone. It allows me to see where you are, what you're doing, who you're texting, where social media, etc. And we go back and forth about that. And he's coming from a police perspective. I'm coming as a therapist perspective. I'm curious what you would have to say about that.
About having apps that monitor?
Yeah, like monitoring and how much you said I pay for this phone. I can look at your I can look at your phone.
Yeah.
Right. And you could do that every day if you wanted to. Right. But do you think you should be reading your kids' texts? Do you think you should be monitoring that stuff? And if so, what age to what age?
Such a good question. So admittedly, I have no monitoring, I have no filtering on any of our devices. And mostly because there's really nothing we haven't talked about and discussed, and everything has always been like so open right from the start. But that being said, I'm a sex educator. I get it. Most of the conversations we're having at our dinner table, most people are not having, right? So, it works for us because everyone is really above board about what they're doing, right? I mean, literally up until we had a rule that anytime the kids posted anything on Instagram, they had to ask our permission first, right? So up until like last year, up until he turned 13, like our kids were asking, may I post this, and it was just a good model for us. I think you have to know your young person. I really do. You have to know your young person. You have to get a sense of who their friends are. And I don't think it's one decision for everyone. And then sometimes, if there's a violation of your trust, then you could say, look, for a period of time, we're going to monitor this because you violated our deal. And if it works, we'll go back to you having the freedom and independence. But I think because we laid out so much in advance that everyone really stuck to it.
And the arena that I work with him in is the substance use disorder community. So he's more worried about, obviously the sex stuff too, but the drugs, the alcohol, and the fear that they're going to get involved and get in trouble with law enforcement or overdose, etc.
Yeah, and again, it's not just about knowing your kids and their friends or your teen and their friends. It's also about knowing yourself, right? Maybe you are the type of person who absolutely needs to have some of that control and just know that it's there for you, and that's okay too. I think it's important that I think we should tell our young people, look, I still have the right to this, right? You're not at an age yet where this is your own, and it's not because I want to get you in trouble. It's because there's a lot out there that you haven't thought about, right? I think that that's okay, and I think we all have to remember that our kids are far more technologically savvy, and they have ways around things that we will not understand. But I think as long as we keep our dialogues open, that look, if you see something or something happens that you are uncomfortable with, please let me know. And I'm not going to yell. I want to help you figure this out.
Meanwhile, I have to ask my kids if I can post on Instagram.
Yes.
You what?
I have to ask them if I'm allowed to post their pictures on Instagram. They control my account. So
all right. So the button that we all have, or some of us have. We alluded to it earlier about pornography. Pornography has existed since antiquity in some way, shape, or form. Pornography, I really think, needs to be looked at as any other form of media that comes with the purpose of entertaining, even if it's to elicit a reaction of negativity, right? The purpose of pornography is to get a reaction out of someone. Sometimes that's good, sometimes that's bad. But it's designed not to educate. And I think one of the things that becomes an issue is if our young people are not getting sex ed from good sources, then it's not a surprise that they look to things that are overtly sexual for information, because that's the only thing they can get, right? So I have absolutely taught groups where I've had 17-year-olds who have said to me, I've said, tell me, what do you think the impact of pornography on you is? And they said, well, if I use pornography, my partner doesn't, then I'll know what to do and they won't. To which I said, you are going to be very disappointed in your real life. And they looked at me and said, what do you mean? I said, well, you know, pornography is some version of a person's fantasy, right? It doesn't mean it's real. It doesn't show you all the nuances and complexities of negotiation, of, you know, boundaries, pleasure, sexual health, protection, talking about whether or not someone's been tested for STIs. Like, how is our relationship going to change if we engage in this behavior, right? All of the things that really get done in all of our experiences, ideally, you know, we don't get in those things. Pornography is directed, right? There's not often representation of diversity. People don't ejaculate 6 feet away from their body. Sorry. You know, all of those things that are like the magic of the movies, but not meant to represent the average experience. One of the things I do tell my younger students in particular, and primarily assigned males, because they're the ones that are far more willing to talk about this, is that, you know, when you are really young, I would say this to you. You know, you should be able to, ideally, get an erection and experience pleasure without relying on pornography, right? And you need to understand yourself. And if you find yourself relying too much on it, that you cannot get an erection or derive any sort of pleasure without it, then you need to take a break, right? And I said to them, look, this generation, you're guinea pigs, for lack of a better word, because we've never had a generation with this much access this early on, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I said, we had pornography, but it was on after midnight. Half of the time it was scrambled. You know, there was no penetration. And while it excited us the same way, you know, it was hard to get. You know, it wasn't so readily available. So that means we have to start consuming it in smarter ways and think about how it's working for us or how it's not. You know, and to be honest about that. So, you know, if we think that someone has seen something in our life, you know, I told you the story before of the fruit porn. It is really important that if a kid has seen something, that we just say, listen, I'm not going to be upset. Tell me what you think you saw. I want to make sure I can help you understand it. Because oftentimes they're scared. Oftentimes they think they're going to be in trouble. And very often they're scared about the reaction that their body had, in particular if it was the first time that they felt that kind of sensation. So, you know, explaining to them that that bodily reaction of feeling good is a really normal part of growing up, and it's a part of being a human being, and it's not necessarily about that thing, but it was, you know, sometimes we see things in our bodies have that reaction, becomes really important. And also because maybe they saw something that they thought was really horrible and scary or non-consensual, and we have to parse through that with them. We don't know, so it's really important to find out what it was, because it might just be a public service announcement for breast cancer screening. You don't know. So culture is really important because everyone has different standards for their communities, for culture. You know, we alluded to the fact that in a Latino family, it might be like nudity might not be a big deal, right? Which means that like if other outsiders are brought in, it means we have to be a little bit more thoughtful about how we explain different cultural norms and expectations or religious norms when we're talking about, you know, with third parties. But also in general, the way we talk about the things that we are exposed to beyond pornography on a regular basis, representation is so important. So I just want you to know that Idris Elba, it's about time. He was on the cover of People's Sexiest Man Alive. But in reality, what we see is considered sexy is often very complicated. It's a certain type of body. The way that what we consider acceptable or not is often based in race and ethnicity and norms, and like the things we say about Taylor Swift are a lot different than what we would say about Rihanna or Beyonce, and it's unacceptable, but we have to think about the language we use to describe bodies and sexy and sex appeal and catch ourselves when we are falling into patterns that sort of are unethical, which oftentimes pop culture conversations are. We should be thinking about media. Some of you may have seen this before. This was an old Calvin Klein ad that says, I flash in my Calvins, but it's actually a picture of upskirting, which is a non-consensual photo up someone's skirt. Like, this is not empowering. You would never be okay if someone did this to you, like, without your knowledge. We should be using everything available to us to say, how does this work for us? Is this healthy? Is this the model that we want? And deal with the complexities of maybe something turns us on, but it's not necessarily something that we want in our own life. And visibility counts. So this is a ad from Third Love. If you're on the internet, you might get, and you have breasts, you get a lot of these ads. Seeing yourself, your body, your shape, your relationship, your gender expression represented is such a big deal, because so much of that emotional sexual health or lack thereof comes from not feeling like you're seen. Right? That you're considered sexy, that you have the right to agency and pleasure and autonomy. So all of this is really important, whether it's accessibility and disability, whether it is race, ethnicity, body shape, religion. You know, there was that CoverGirl ad a few years ago where James Charles, I know, embroiled in a huge scandal before that. You know, James Charles was in an ad for CoverGirl. He was the first male spokesperson for CoverGirl, and there was a Muslim woman in it. There were black women in it. There were Asian women in it. There was diversity, and it was a big deal for like a mass beauty market advertisement. So all of this stuff matters, and that means for us in our practices that if we have posters, if we have brochures, if we have anything that we're handing out, that it shows a range of people, right? That we're not just talking to one group, that everyone feels like I'm coming here and I'm seen in some way. And then, of course, you know, it is political and it does impact what we do, how we do it, the information we get, our rights, our partners' rights, our friends' rights, the people we encounter, different laws within states, equity, equality, safety. I don't have to go into it. Clearly we know all of these things, but we have to just recognize that decisions get made that impact us, directly and indirectly. So I would say at the end, when someone says, if a client says, you know, my kids don't want to talk to me, sucks for them. And this is what I often tell parents. I'll say, okay, so this is how I would do it. If I was sitting with my kid and I said, not mine because they're used to hearing a lot, but someone else's, and they said, I know everything already, what I would say is, okay, here's the deal. I want to talk to you about some things. We're not going to do it all at once, but I want to talk to you about something now. But it's actually not for you. It's not for you. It's for me. When I became a parent or a caregiver, I made certain promises that I would do certain things, that I would talk to you about certain things. So this is for my benefit. You could just sit here and listen, but it's not for you, it's for me, right? It's really hard for a young person to have a comeback when you say something like that, right? And also you're acknowledging this is on us as adults to do. This is not on our kids or, you know, or our whomever it is to come to us and say, I need your help. It's for us to say, we are the people. We're supposed to be the role models. We're supposed to do these things for you. And parents and caregivers count. The science supports it. So the condom and banana thing always reminds me of my own education. But don't worry about the text. The state of sexual health in the United States is fairly detestable. Yes, our teen birth and pregnancy rates are the lowest they've ever been, but compared to all developed nations, they're still not great. Half of all new STI infections are attributed to people between the ages of 15 to 24. That is because we are not giving young people education or the skills or equity to make good, healthy, informed decisions. There is great racial, ethnic, and LGBTQ disproportionate distributions and negative sexual health outcomes because of access and equity. Again, unacceptable. These are all the things we have to be aware of and do better. Oftentimes nowadays, less adolescents are learning about birth control from formal sex ed They're being told to say no. Well, that's great, but they're actually not being told how to say yes and what to do if they say yes, how to take the necessary steps to make smart decisions. And then, of course, we have a responsibility to be talking early. All the research has shown time and time again that parents who talk to their kids about safer sex are more likely to use protection, and first-time use of protection predicts future use, which is huge, amazing. Last month, a study was released in in JAMA Pediatrics that between 4 and 8% of boys reported having sex before the age of 13. Race and ethnicity played a role in it, and parent conversation, or in this case, lack thereof, played a role. So we do have a responsibility to start talking early when we expect. We can't wait until puberty. We can't wait until they ask a question. We can't wait until we get a phone call from someone that says, I think they're watching pornography. It has to take place before all of that, so that they know they have certain rights. They know they have the right to speak up for themselves. They know how their bodies work. They know how to get access to information and services whenever they make good decisions, or whenever they want to make a decision. So in terms of setting the stage and guidelines for openness with your own clients and your own practices, as well as what you can encourage them to do in their own home, these are just some of the things that I recommend. Reminding people to take a breath, right? Like, okay, this can provoke a lot of anxiety. That's all right. Take a breath. Listen to what young people are saying. Like, really listen to what they're asking. We tend to just sort of unload. We hear one word and we freak out. But listen to them first before we make judgments. Admit when we don't have answers, but make sure we follow up and find answers. Tell the truth. Own your discomfort. Tell them, you know what? I didn't have models for talking about these things, but I'm committed to doing better. Or if you really can't, as I said earlier, get a proxy. Practice makes perfect, big deal. So you mess up. You come back again and say, you know what? I didn't say the thing I really wanted to say. So I need to follow up. And then again, this is often the most difficult. Practicing what we preach. If we tell them that we want them to do something, we need to be modeling it to the best of our ability. The consent piece with Instagram and social media is the easiest example of that, but it is really hard to have young people that follow through if we're hypocrites. So I want you to develop, I wanted you to develop sexual health skills. I want young people to develop sexual health skills, which means, encouraging caregivers and parents to talk about, how do we role play negotiation and consent? How do we use condoms correctly? How do we talk to doctors if a parent isn't in the room? And by the way, encourage young people to have relationships with their healthcare providers beyond when their parents or caregivers are in the room. So we have like 15 minutes. I can't even believe we've done this for so long. Thank you for all staying awake. I just want to give you the time and space to either relax, ask any questions, if there's anything that's come up or you think that I haven't tackled, because I know it's a lot. No pressure.
Anybody has any questions online either?
HPV shot.
Yes. Okay. So
Have you found parents being kind of resistant to it? I know my sister, her daughter started having sex, and she was like, oh my God, and they said you need to get them on Gardasil, and she's like, but that means they would have sex.
So this is what I would say when the Gardasil conversation comes up. So Gardasil is a vaccine that prevents the most common strains of HPV, some of which are the ones that directly lead to cancers. Some can cause genital warts. There are tons of strains of HPV. Some come and go. HPV is a super common virus for people to have. But Gardasil is super effective against the ones that are most virulent, the ones that young people could be exposed to and that have bigger potential outcomes. It is not a panacea for all things, right? It does not prevent anything except those strains that it prevents. So like giving someone Gardasil is not giving them license to have any kind of sex. It's just saying, you know what, you're going to make certain decisions, and I would like to make sure I could protect what I could protect.
It also like prevents anal warts, right?
So, because HPV, genital warts can be anal, can be vaginal, can be inner, scrotal, inner thigh.
I know like gay men, they're starting to push.
Yeah, so Gardasil is now recommended not just for people with cervixes, but also for assigned males starting around puberty as well. And so that was a really big deal because when this was a super political thing, because when the FDA first approved it, the public discussion was about cervical cancer, because how could we not get behind protection against cervical cancer? Once you start vaccinating boys, you're acknowledging that there is a sexual component to this, right? It's not just about cervical cancer. So, and again, look, HPV, even though like head, neck, and throat cancers are like still a very small number, it is still possible from unprotected oral sex with someone who has HPV to be exposed to certain type of cancers. So, again, it's not
Become a carrier.
right.
And they pass it on.
You can carry and pass it on, never have any symptoms. So it doesn't prevent everything. It doesn't cure everything. But I think as adults and parents and caregivers and just like members of society, we should give them the tools to prevent what we can, because our options, if we don't, the outcomes are pretty significant, right?
They'll have to get their cervix scraped.
Well, there's a lot of different things, right? It could be that. It could be a type of cancer. It could be a sexually transmitted infection. So again, part of giving Gardasil, though, is also saying to your kids, look, we should be informing young people about what vaccines do and what they're for. Right? And being able to say, look, this one prevents these things, not everything. So whenever you're going to make decisions about sex, it's important that you still use protection, that you and partners are tested, right? That it's not just a green light. It's one part of a sexual health toolkit. And the more things we have in that toolkit, the better off we are. Yeah.
So would you put birth control for teenager in that also, especially the birth controls where you put it in and forget it?
Like a LARC, long-acting reversible?
Yeah, but because then it's like they don't really even have to really be paying attention anymore. Do you know what I mean? Like
So the interesting thing, I think the more options we have available to us, the better. And there is something super powerful about being able to control your fertility. And IUDs, LARCs are amazing options. But again, if we're talking about someone with a penis and someone with a vulva and vagina, dual use is clearly the gold standard, which means condoms plus, right? And again, sometimes like I have some teenage girl students that are on LARCs or even on hormonal contraceptives that will ask me, should I tell a new partner that I'm on birth control? And I'll say, no. No, they haven't earned that information yet, right? Because it becomes so easy to then forego condoms or barriers.
Do you have any resources, they could be like books or whatever, on working with adolescents that have been diagnosed with STIs?
I can find some for you, for sure. Because the one thing I don't ever want to do is we don't want to stigmatize having a sexually transmitted infection. They're super common. All are treatable, some are curable. And it's like I challenge my students all the time if they say, if someone is clean, I'm like, could we not do that? It's not like clean or dirty. You have an STI? It's curable, it's treatable. It's not about being clean or dirty, right? So it means us also changing the language for young people, because it's so easy to fall back on those things, and not making people feel badly, right? We're exposed to a lot of things growing up. It doesn't make us bad people. It just means we have to take agency over our bodies and talk to doctors and partners, right? And that's doable when we give people the skills to do it.
Any other questions, guys?
You're like, it has been 4 hours. Get me out of here.
Logan back. I love Logan. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.